He killed while the world hunted someone else. He was counting on that. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we examine 3 disturbing cases where the real story lurked behind what initially seemed entirely innocent. Every piece of this story was built on thorough research, verified facts, and a deep commitment to getting it right. No detail was chosen carelessly. Each one carries the significance of the true events behind it. The purpose of this channel is simple: to make sure history like this is never allowed to disappear. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the shadow behind Chikatilo. Konstantin Cheryomushkin, a.k.a. the Bataysk maniac, Chikatilo's double. Now let's begin. Terror had already swallowed the city whole. Police swarming the forests, investigators scanning every face on every train platform, Soviet authorities running the most intense serial killer manhunt in their nation's history. All eyes locked on one monster, and somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, another set of eyes watched, calculated, and smiled, because he understood something chilling. When the whole world is afraid of one wolf, no one sees the second one crouching in the dark. That is the story of Konstantin Cheryomushkin, a name history nearly forgot. A man who murdered young women in the very same region, during the very same years as the infamous Andrei Chikatilo. He did not just kill in Chikatilo's shadow. He chose it deliberately. He weaponized it. And while the investigators ran in one direction, Cheryomushkin drove his car down deserted roads in the opposite direction, with a victim in the seat beside him who had no idea she would never go home again. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. There are places in this world that carry a particular kind of silence. Not the peaceful kind, not the silence of Sunday mornings or countryside meadows, but the silence of things unsaid, crimes buried under decades of Soviet censorship, and stories that were swallowed whole by a system that preferred order over truth. Bataysk was one of those places. Situated just south of Rostov-on-Don in Russia's Rostov Oblast, Bataysk was what urban planners of the Soviet era called a satellite town. A smaller settlement orbiting a larger city, functioning as an overflow community for workers, families, and the kind of ordinary people who woke up, went to work, came home, and asked nothing extraordinary of life. Streets lined with Soviet-era apartment blocks, small squares where children played, women who walked to the market in the morning and expected to return by noon. Nothing about Bataysk suggested danger. Nothing about its gray, familiar skyline whispered of what was stirring inside one of its residents. Konstantin Cheryomushkin was born in 1963. The precise date and location of his birth remain unclear, a fact that speaks to the chaotic record-keeping of Soviet-era provincial life as much as to how thoroughly unremarkable his beginnings appeared. He was not a child who raised alarms. He was not a child who suffered in visible ways. By most external accounts, he was, in the language his neighbors might have used, a spoiled boy, one who received what he wanted, who was not denied in the way that disciplines character, who grew up with the particular entitlement that comes not from wealth but from permissiveness. Yet beneath that surface, something was corroding. At some point in his youth, Cheryomushkin discovered a truth about his family that shattered whatever internal architecture he had quietly been building around his identity. His father, the man who had raised him, was not his biological father at all. The man was infertile. He had, in a private arrangement that speaks to both the desperation and the strange compromises of Soviet family life, permitted his wife to conceive children with other men. Whether this was discussed openly in the household, whether Cheryomushkin stumbled upon it accidentally or was told directly, the records do not say. What specialists who later examined his psychology did say was this: the discovery broke something in him. Not visibly, not immediately, but in the way that a hairline crack in a foundation breaks a building. Slowly, silently, and with eventual devastation. The question of identity in a society as rigid and patriarchal as the Soviet Union was not a trivial one. A man's place in a family, his lineage, his sense of self in relation to a father, these were not merely psychological abstractions. They were the scaffolding of a Soviet male identity. To discover that the father was a lie, that the family was a constructed fiction, that the blood in his veins was that of an unknown man his mother had visited for reasons of biological necessity. This was not simply a family secret. For Cheryomushkin, it appears to have been a detonation that happened in slow motion, one whose shockwave would not fully reach the surface for years. He moved through adolescence and early adulthood without attracting the kind of attention that might have intervened. He was not a known violent offender in his youth. He did, however, come to the attention of authorities on 2 separate occasions for car theft. A detail that seems minor in retrospect but was in fact deeply revealing. Cars mattered to Cheryomushkin. They represented something specific to him: mobility, control, the ability to go places and take things. He was convicted twice for car theft. Neither conviction produced any significant consequence. He served his time, such as it was, and returned to the streets of Bataisk. By the mid-1980s, Cheryomushkin was a young man in his early 20s. He owned a personal vehicle, or at minimum had regular access to one, a fact that in Soviet-era provincial Russia was not without significance. Cars were not universally available. Ownership placed a person in a particular bracket, gave them a particular kind of informal authority on the street. A man with a car could offer people rides. A man with a car could take people places. A man with a car in a town where public transport was limited and the roads at night were dark and mostly empty. That man had something to offer and something terrible to exploit. Meanwhile, in the broader canvas of Rostov Oblast, another story was being written in blood. Andrei Chikatilo had been operating in the forests, train stations, and pathways of the region since 1978. By the mid-1980s, he had already killed dozens of women and children, luring them with conversation, with offers of assistance, with the unremarkable face of a middle-aged man who seemed harmless. Soviet authorities had launched a massive, sprawling manhunt called Lesopolosa, the forest strip operation, deploying hundreds of investigators, plainclothes officers, and forensic teams in an effort to track the killer who had torn through the windbreaks and wooded corridors of Rostov Oblast with relentless brutality. The operation was one of the largest of its kind in Soviet history. It dominated police resources. It saturated the attention of investigators. Everyone in Rostov Oblast knew about the killer in the forests. Fear had settled into the region like a second winter, an atmospheric cold that did not lift regardless of the season. And Cheryomushkin was watching all of it. Investigators who later reconstructed his thinking would arrive at a conclusion that is as disturbing as anything in this case. Cheryomushkin did not simply happen to kill during the same era and in the same region as Chikatilo. He appears to have calculated that the Lesopolosa investigation would serve as cover. He understood, on some predatory level, that when an entire region is mobilized around catching one killer, a second killer has remarkable freedom to operate. The machinery of detection was pointing in a specific direction. Cheryomushkin drove in the other direction. There was, however, an important distinction between his method and Chikatilo's, a distinction that would ultimately be part of his undoing, though not before 4 young women lost their lives. Chikatilo lured victims on foot. He had no car. He approached people at bus stops and train stations, walked with them into forests and fields, and attacked them in isolated places that he reached on his own 2 feet. He took nothing from his victims, no valuables, no property. His motivation was entirely sexual and sadistic. Cheryomushkin operated differently. He used his car as a weapon of approach. He offered young women rides. He was plausible, presentable enough, known in the community at least by sight. He would pull up alongside someone, offer a lift, and drive them not to their intended destination but to somewhere deserted, somewhere where his intentions could be fulfilled without witness. After the assaults and killings, he took the victims' valuables. This was not purely opportunistic theft. It was part of how he thought about his crimes, a combination of violence and acquisition that reflected the particular shape of his pathology. The violence was the core. The theft was the trophy. And unlike Chikatilo, who killed in forests and left his victims where they fell, Cheryomushkin added another element to his first murder. One that prosecutors and investigators would later describe as an act of particular deliberateness, suggesting he was acutely aware of the need to destroy evidence. He burned the body. That first killing in 1986 set the template for what was to follow, and it introduced the investigators, when they eventually found what remained, to a crime scene that raised more questions than it answered. A fire, a girl, a life extinguished not just by violence but by flame designed to eliminate her from the record. Her name was Svetlana Yefimova. She was the first. She would not be the last. The Rostov Oblast in 1986 was a region stretched to its investigative limits, its police force divided between the chaos of the Chikatilo manhunt and the ordinary demands of law enforcement in a Soviet industrial region. When reports emerged of a murder in Betaisk, a satellite town, a smaller jurisdiction, a case that seemed localized and potentially unrelated to the Lesopolosa investigation, it drew attention, but perhaps not the full weight of resources that it deserved. Initially, and catastrophically, investigators considered the possibility that it was Chikatilo operating in a new location. That assumption, however well-intentioned, cost time. And in the space of that lost time, Cheryomushkin was still driving the dark roads of Betaisk with his windows up and his engine running. The Soviet system, for all its bureaucratic machinery, was not built for the kind of psychological profiling and cross-jurisdictional analysis that might have identified Cheryomushkin sooner. The Lesopolosa investigation was centralized around one killer. Adding a second killer to the picture required investigators to think in a way that the Soviet investigative framework did not naturally accommodate, that two predators could be operating simultaneously in the same region, with superficially similar patterns but distinct methodologies. It took time, careful comparison, and the accumulating weight of evidence to pull the Betaisk murders away from the Chikatilo file and treat them as a separate, independent case. By the time that distinction was firmly established, Cheryomushkin had killed again, and once more after that. He was, in the language of criminal investigation, an organized offender, methodical in his approach, careful in his selection, deliberate in his use of a vehicle to control both the encounter and the aftermath. He was not a man who acted in moments of blind rage on whatever victim happened to cross his path. He selected, he drove, he offered. He waited for the moment when a young woman's trust was the only thing standing between her and the horror he was already planning. For women, for lives, for separate acts of violence so extreme that the court would ultimately describe them as carried out with particular cruelty. The specific legal language in Soviet criminal law reserved for the most extreme cases, the ones where the killing itself was not sufficient to describe what the perpetrator had done. Because for Cheryomushkin, the killing was never the end of it. What he did after they were dead, what he took from their bodies in a ritual that mirrored, in disturbing ways, the mutilations Chikatilo committed on his victims, placed him in a category of violence that goes beyond murder. It spoke to a psychology that found meaning not just in the act of killing but in the desecration of what remained. He was arrested in early 1989. By then, 3 more women had followed Svetlana Yefimova into death. Their names were Elena Gaeva, Tanya Klobuskina, and Oksana Yakovenko. They were young. They were from Betaisk. They had accepted or been forced into a ride with a man who presented as ordinary, as local, as someone whose face might have been familiar from the street. They did not survive that ride. And when Cheryomushkin was finally placed in a room across from investigators and confronted with the evidence that had been assembled against him, he did something that told them everything they needed to know about who he was. He confessed. Not reluctantly, not under duress, not with the performance of remorse that courts sometimes see from defendants calculating their best outcome. He confessed with a directness that carried within it something investigators found deeply unsettling. He had done it. He had been watching the Chikatilo investigation. He had expected it to provide him cover. He was, in his own estimation, cunning, and for 3 years that cunning had worked. It had just not worked forever. There is a particular kind of killer that history finds most difficult to account for in the clean narrative of motive and psychology. Not the tortured loner, not the visibly broken man, but the one who functioned. The one who drove to the market, parked the car, walked among people, nodded at neighbors, and appeared as one more forgettable face in the orderly Soviet fabric of provincial life. Konstantin Cheryomushkin was that kind of killer. He held himself together in public. He was young, barely in his 20s when the murders began, and in the context of a small satellite town where everyone had a rough sense of who lived where, he was not unknown. He was simply not remarkable. That invisibility was not accidental. It was the first layer of the mask he wore, and he wore it with the unconscious ease of someone who had been constructing it since childhood. Since the moment, perhaps, that he discovered the family secret that had fractured his sense of self and replaced it with something colder and more calculated. The murders began in 1986. To understand them fully, it is necessary to understand the geography of Bataisk and its surrounds. This was not a vast wilderness. It was not the remote forestland that Chikatilo used, those long, leafless windbreaks and isolated woodland corridors that stretched between Soviet industrial towns and rural settlements. Bataisk was a town. It had streets. It had people. The deserted places Cheryomushkin used were not forests at the edge of civilization. They were the empty outskirts that every town possesses, the areas between the built and the unbuilt, where a car could park without attracting attention and the nearest witness was far enough away to matter. He knew those places. He had driven the roads often enough, the way a predator patrols a territory, to know exactly where the dark patches were, exactly where a man could stop his car and do what he intended without fear of interruption. Svetlana Yefimova was the first. She was young, as all his victims were. The specific circumstances of how Cheryomushkin encountered her, whether he offered her a ride, whether he approached her on foot, whether she knew him, are not preserved in the available record with granular precision. What is recorded is what happened to her and what happened after. She was raped. She was killed. And then, in an act that distinguished this first murder from what would follow and revealed the particular coldness operating behind Cheryomushkin's eyes, he set fire to her body. The burning of Svetlana Yefimova was not the act of a panicked young man who had done something terrible and desperately wanted to hide it. It was methodical. It required preparation or, at minimum, forethought. Fuel of some kind, the deliberate application of flame, waiting long enough to ensure the destruction was sufficient. It was evidence destruction calculated in advance, not improvised in the aftermath of impulse. This tells investigators something fundamental about Cheryomushkin's state of mind in his very first murder. He was already thinking about tomorrow. He was already planning to continue. The body, or what remained of it, was eventually discovered. The cause of death had to be reconstructed through what the fire had not destroyed. What investigators found was enough to understand the broad nature of what had happened, but the fire had done its work well enough to complicate the evidence trail. The next 3 murders followed a consistent pattern, consistent in method, consistent in brutality, consistent in what Cheryomushkin did to the bodies after death. The offer of a ride, the drive to isolation, the rape carried out with violence rather than with any pretense of seduction, the killing, and then, after death, the mutilations. Cheryomushkin cut from the bodies of his victims their mammary glands and their external genitalia. This detail, precise, deliberate, carried out after the victims were already dead, places Cheryomushkin in a specific and disturbing category of killer. Post-mortem mutilation of this nature is not random. It is not the frenzied destruction of someone lost in rage. It is purposeful. It requires a kind of focused attention directed at the body after the violence of killing has already passed. It says, in the language that forensic psychologists have spent decades learning to read, this man found something in what he did after death that he was specifically seeking. Whether that something was control, a perverse form of collection, a ritual that satisfied a compulsion he could not name even to himself, the fact of it is documented. The act was repeated. Across 3 victims, after Elena Gaeva, Tanya Klobuskina, and Oksana Yakovenko, the pattern did not change. What also did not change was his method of approach. The car. To the victims, the offer of a ride was an ordinary social interaction. The kind that happened dozens of times a day in a Soviet town where public transport was unreliable and walking long distances was simply what people did. A local man, known to some by face if not by name, offering to take someone to where they were going. A moment of small trust, of accepted helpfulness, of the mundane social contract that makes daily life navigable. That trust is what Cheryomushkin exploited. He presented himself as the solution to an inconvenience. He drove them somewhere they could not escape. After each murder, he also took the victim's valuables. This is one of the details that investigators later used to distinguish the Bataysk murders from the Chikatilo case with certainty. Chikatilo took nothing material from his victims. He left bodies stripped of their dignity but not their possessions. Cheryomushkin, by contrast, stole from the dead wallets, jewelry, whatever had been carried or worn by the victim. The theft was pragmatic, perhaps. It may also have been something else. A further assertion of ownership over someone he had destroyed, a taking beyond killing that extended the power of the act into the realm of property. The investigative team handling the Bataysk murders did not initially have the luxury of approaching them as a standalone case. In the context of the Lesopolosa operation, every murder in Rostov Oblast that bore the hallmarks of sexual violence against young women was a potential Chikatilo killing. The investigators knew Chikatilo was out there. They were hunting him with everything they had. When Bataysk produced a dead girl, then another, the default assumption was that the same hand was responsible. It took careful forensic comparison to pull the cases apart. Several key distinctions emerged. The presence of a car at the scenes, indicated by the remote locations chosen and the absence of walking distance alternatives, was the first significant difference. Chikatilo did not drive. He was a man of foot travel, of public transport, of the long patient walks that brought him to his victims through forests and along railway lines. A killer using a personal vehicle was operating on a different profile entirely. The second distinction was the theft of valuables. Chikatilo, in all of his documented crimes, did not steal from victims. The taking of possessions was simply not part of his pathology. For the Bataysk killer, it was present at every scene. The third distinction, or rather, the shared element that briefly confused the investigation, was the nature of the postmortem injuries. When investigators observed that the Bataysk killer had also mutilated his victims after death, the superficial similarity to Chikatilo's crimes pulled them momentarily back toward the single killer assumption. Both men mutilated, but the nature of the mutilation was different. The locations, the patterns, the method all diverged under closer examination. These were two men, operating by their own internal logics in the same region at the same time, both engaged in acts of extreme violence against women. That realization, that the Rostov Oblast was producing not one but two killers simultaneously, was one that investigators arrived at with the specific dread of people who are already overwhelmed and have just been handed a second disaster. But there was something else the investigators eventually pieced together, something that transformed this case from terrible to profoundly disturbing in a different dimension entirely. Cheryomushkin knew about the Chikatilo investigation. This was not speculation. When he was eventually arrested and confessed, the interrogation revealed the outline of a man who had been watching the Lesopolosa operation with the calculating attention of someone who understood its implications for his own freedom. He had seen the resources being deployed. He had understood that the investigative focus was enormous but directional. It pointed at one killer, one profile, one set of crimes. And he had used that directional focus as a kind of shield, committing his murders in the reasonable expectation that they would either be attributed to Chikatilo or fall through the cracks of an investigation stretched to its limits. There is a word for this that the forensic lexicon does not quite contain: predatory intelligence. Not genius, not brilliance, but the specific, cold-blooded cunning of a man who thought not just about what he wanted to do but about how not to be caught doing it. He had chosen his moment carefully. He had chosen his region because it was already contaminated with fear. He had chosen his method, the car, the remote location, the offer of a ride, specifically because it diverged from Chikatilo's method, meaning that even if investigators noticed the Bataysk crimes, the profile would not match. He was right. For 3 years, it worked. What broke the shield, ultimately, was a combination of investigative persistence and the specific physical evidence that Cheryomushkin had left despite his caution. The car was traceable eventually. The stolen valuables were recoverable in certain respects. The geography of the crimes, the locations Cheryomushkin chose, consistent in character, suggesting someone who knew them well, who returned to familiar ground, began to narrow the radius within which investigators looked. The three women who followed Svetlana Yefimova, Elena Gaeva, Tanya Klobuskina, and Oksana Yakovenko, had each encountered the same brief moment of ordinary social interaction before the horror began. A car pulling alongside, a face they may or may not have recognized, an offer, a decision, the kind of small, unremarkable decision that millions of people make every day without consequence, to accept. Elena Gaeva was one of Bateysk's daughters. She had not moved away, had not sought a different life in a larger city. She was there, in the town, as young women in Soviet provincial life often were, going about the daily rhythms of work and home and whatever small pleasures the town afforded. What happened to her in that deserted place where Cheryomushkin drove her is described in the case record with the blunt language of forensic documentation. Rape, killing, post-mortem mutilation, theft of valuables. The language is clinical. The reality it describes is the absolute destruction of a human being by another human being who had made a private decision that her life was his to take. Tanya Klobuskina. Her name sits in the record alongside the others with the same formal brevity. Another young woman in Bateysk. Another encounter with the car, the offer, the drive. The same end. The same mutilations. The same cold ritual of taking after killing. She was gone, and the town that had made no particular preparation for a predator among its residents absorbed her absence the way small communities absorb sudden losses, with grief, with incomprehension, with the quiet terror that asks, was this random, or was there a pattern? Was this a singular tragedy, or was something hunting among them? By the time Oksana Yakovenko died, the answer to that question was beginning to sharpen into terrible clarity. The series was not over. The killer was not moving on. He was still there, still driving, still selecting. 3 years. For murders. And Cheryomushkin was still in Bateysk, driving the same roads, watching the Chikatilo investigation proceed with its massive mobilization, listening, one imagines, to the silence that confirmed he had not yet been identified, that his calculated gamble on the chaos of the Lesopolosa operation was still paying out. He was wrong to think it would last indefinitely. But he was right that it had lasted this long. And in those 3 years, in the darkness between the lampposts of a Soviet satellite town, for young women had paid the price of his cunning with their lives. The process of separating the Bateysk murders from the Chikatilo file was not swift, and it was not clean. In the world of Soviet criminal investigation, the bureaucratic weight of a major operation like Lesopolosa had a kind of gravitational pull. Everything orbiting the same region, the same victim profile, the same window of years was drawn toward it, assessed against it, and either absorbed into the central case or set aside as anomalous. The Bateysk murders were anomalous. But acknowledging anomaly in a system built around hierarchical certainty required investigators to argue against the momentum of their own operation, and that argument took time to win. The investigators from the Rostov Regional Prosecutor's Office who eventually took the Bateysk murders as their primary focus were working in the shadow of an operation that dwarfed their resources. Lesopolosa had the full weight of the RSFSR Prosecutor's Office behind it. It had personnel from Moscow. It had the specific, horrible gravity of a case that had already consumed years and dozens of lives. The Bateysk murders were 4 killings in a satellite town. They mattered enormously, for lives, for families shattered, but in the calculus of investigative resource allocation, they sat beside Lesopolosa the way a candle sits beside a bonfire. Nevertheless, the investigators worked. They had evidence. They had patterns. The car was the central thread. In Soviet provincial Russia, private car ownership created a traceable record. Vehicles were registered. They moved through a world with only limited possibilities. Fuel was purchased at state stations, repairs were done at state garages, vehicles with particular features could be described by witnesses. The investigators knew their killer drove. They began, with painstaking methodology, to build a picture of who in Bataysk and its immediate surrounds owned a vehicle and matched the profile that the crime scenes were describing. Male, young or middle young, familiar with the deserted outskirts of the town, capable of presenting himself as non-threatening to a young woman who would accept a ride. The victims' known movements in the hours before their deaths provided directional information. People who had seen them last, routes they had been traveling, the locations their bodies were found, measured against where they had last been seen, created geographic lines that pointed toward specific roads, specific approaches, specific areas of the town that a local resident with a car and knowledge of the terrain would know. Then there were the valuables. When Cheryomushkin took property from the dead, he did not take it to admire in private. At some point, those items entered circulation, sold, traded, used. Tracking what had been taken and where it appeared was painstaking work that required the cooperation of state trade networks, market surveillance, and the careful questioning of people who might have encountered items they had no reason to think were connected to violence. But this, too, was a thread that could be pulled. It is also probable that the community itself, increasingly frightened by the awareness that young women in Bataysk were dying, produced information. In a town of that size, people talked. People noticed. A man seen with a particular young woman shortly before her disappearance. A car that had been in a specific location. The small observations that in isolation mean nothing but in aggregate begin to construct a face. The face that emerged eventually was Cheryomushkin's. The exact sequence of events that led to his arrest in early 1989, which witness, which piece of evidence, which thread pulled, which knot loose, is not preserved in granular public detail. What is documented is the outcome. Cheryomushkin was arrested. He was brought in. He was placed in the specific situation that distinguishes the guilty from the innocent, the room with the investigators, the questions that know more than they appear to, the silence that gradually fills with the weight of what cannot be denied. He confessed. The confession was, by the account of the investigators, relatively prompt. Cheryomushkin did not sustain a lengthy performance of innocence. He did not construct an elaborate alibi that required weeks of dismantling. When the investigators made clear that the evidence against him had reached a sufficient weight, he confessed to the murders of Svetlana Yefimova, Elena Gaeva, Tanya Klobuskina, and Oksana Yakovenko. Within that confession, in the accounting of his crimes, emerged the detail that would define how this case was understood and remembered. Cheryomushkin had been aware of the Chikatilo investigation. He had believed that the sheer scale of Lesopolosa, the hundreds of officers, the vast forensic operation, the institutional energy focused on catching one killer, would provide him with cover. He had expected the Bataysk murders to be attributed to Chikatilo, or simply to languish unsolved in the noise of a region already overwhelmed by a greater horror. This revelation transformed the investigators' understanding of the case in a fundamental way. They had assumed that the timing and location of the Bataysk murders, occurring during Lesopolosa, in the same region as Chikatilo's crimes, was either coincidence or, at most, an opportunistic exploitation of a distracted police force. The confession revealed something more calculated. Cheryomushkin had not just exploited the distraction. He had planned around it. He had made a strategic decision about when and where to kill based on his awareness of the investigative landscape. For the investigators, this was an unsettling kind of intelligence to encounter. They were accustomed, as investigators the world over are accustomed, to killers who were impulsive, chaotic, governed by compulsion rather than strategy. The fully organized killer, the one who thinks not just about the act but about its consequences and actively structures the act to minimize those consequences, represents a more alarming category. Cheryomushkin was not, by any measure, a criminal genius, but he was calculating. He had thought about the Chikatilo investigation, assessed its implications for his own freedom, and adjusted his behavior accordingly. He had also, investigators noted with grim interest, apparently kept watch on the investigation's progress. He had killed when the heat was on Chikatilo. When the heat momentarily swung toward Bataysk, when investigators began to look more closely at the divergent evidence profile of the satellite town murders, Cheryomushkin had killed Oksana Yakovenko, his fourth victim, and then stopped. Whether he stopped because he sensed the net tightening, or whether the arrest came quickly enough that a fifth murder was never attempted, the record does not make entirely clear. What is clear is that his operational period ended in 1989, the same year Chikatilo was finally arrested after the extraordinary denouement of the Lesopolosa investigation. 2 killers, 1 region, 1 year of arrest. The symmetry is almost darkly theatrical, except that 4 young women were not theatrical figures. They were real. They had names. They had families who were told in 1989 what had happened to them, and who had to absorb not just the horror of the deaths but the knowledge that their daughters, sisters, and loved ones had been killed by a man who had designed his crimes to evade detection, had used the terror of another killer as camouflage, and had succeeded for 3 years. In the interrogation and in the subsequent legal proceedings, the portrait of Cheryomushkin that emerged was layered in ways that the simple label of serial killer does not fully capture. He was a man with a documented criminal history, small-scale but revealing. He was a man whose foundational sense of identity had been shattered by the revelation of his father's infertility and the circumstances of his conception. He was a man who had lived in the specific psychic space between entitlement, the spoiled child who always got what he wanted, and rupture, the revelation that what he thought he was had been false. The psychologists who examined him found in him the specific cognitive architecture of someone who had converted a wound into a weapon. The rage that the revelation about his father should perhaps have produced, grief, perhaps, or the particular anger of a betrayed identity, had not expressed itself in the expected ways. It had gone underground. It had calcified. It had emerged years later as something directed outward, specifically at young women, at female bodies, at the kind of violence that is always fundamentally about power and its perverse expression. The post-mortem mutilations, the cutting of mammary glands and external genitalia from the bodies of his victims, spoke directly to this. In the vocabulary of criminal psychology, mutilations of this nature are typically categorized as expressions of a specific and extreme hostility toward the female body, combined with a compulsion to possess, to take, to assert dominance in ways that extend beyond the act of killing. Cheryomushkin cut from his victims specific feminine anatomical features. The symbolism is not subtle. Whatever its precise psychological origin, whatever it expressed in the landscape of his interior life, it communicated to the investigators and the court the depth of the pathology they were dealing with. The investigators were also struck by another element of the confession. Cheryomushkin had hoped, specifically and consciously, that his crimes would be compared to those of Chikatilo. He had wanted the association. Whether this was purely strategic, the belief that being grouped with Chikatilo's crimes would confuse the investigation, or whether there was something more narcissistic in it, a desire for the kind of infamy that Chikatilo was already accumulating in the whispered fear of the region, is a question the record raises without definitively resolving. What it suggests, at minimum, is a man who had followed Chikatilo's crimes with more than passing interest. A man who had thought about them carefully enough to understand the investigative profile being built around them. A man who had modeled himself in some dimension on another killer, not because he admired the specific acts, but because the structure of terror and evasion that Chikatilo had managed was, to Cheryomushkin, something worthy of study. That is a particular kind of darkness that exists at the intersection of violence and ego. The killer who does not just kill, but who is aware of himself killing, who constructs a narrative around his crimes, who places them in context, who watches the world's response to another predator and thinks, I can use this. I can be more careful. I can be worse. He was wrong about that last part. He was not worse. He was different, and he was ultimately as catchable as any killer who leaves behind the physical traces of violence against human bodies. But he had been calculating enough to delay that catching for 3 years and 4 lives. The Rostov Regional Court received the case on the 3rd of November, 1989. The verdict was not in question for long. The evidence was substantial. The confession was on record. The 4 murders, described in the formal legal language of Soviet criminal law as carried out with particular cruelty, constituted a case that the court processed with the gravity it deserved. Konstantin G. Cheryomushkin was sentenced to death. A death sentence in the Soviet Union, and in the immediate post-Soviet Russian state that followed the USSR's collapse in 1991, was not a bureaucratic abstraction. It was a specific physical event, administered by firing squad, carried out in a particular prison at a time not disclosed to the condemned in advance. The unpredictability of the final moment was itself considered part of the punishment. The long wait, the indefinite horizon, the impossibility of preparing for a death that would arrive unannounced. Between the sentencing in November 1989 and the execution, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. The political architecture that had defined Cheryomushkin's world, the communist state, the planned economy, the prosecutor's office of the RSFSR, the entire superstructure under which he had grown up and within which he had killed, all of it fractured and reformed in the extraordinary years between 1989 and 1991. The country that convicted Konstantin Cheryomushkin ceased to exist before his sentence was carried out. But the sentence survived the state. In 1993, in Novocherkassk, the same Rostov Oblast city where, with another grim symmetry, Andrei Chikatilo had been executed the previous year, Konstantin G. Cheryomushkin was taken from his cell and shot by firing squad. He was between 29 and 30 years old. He had spent 4 years on death row in the particular Russian prison system, which was not a lenient one. He died in the same town, in the same year, by the same method as the monster whose shadow he had tried to hide within. There is a strange, cold justice to that geography, though justice in this context is a word that stretches. It does not bring back Svetlana Yefimova. It does not restore Elena Gaeva, Tanya Klobuskina, or Oksana Yakovenko to the families who lost them. It does not give those families the answers they deserved about every detail of what happened to their daughters. Answers that the Soviet legal system, operating under its own protocols of documentation and disclosure, may never have provided in full. What it provides, in the cold arithmetic of legal consequence, is this. A man who killed 4 young women in calculated acts of sexual violence, who mutilated their bodies and stole from their corpses, who deliberately exploited the suffering of a region already terrorized by another killer to extend his own murderous career. That man did not die peacefully in old age. He faced the same state machinery that had struggled to find him, that had been confused by his deliberate similarities to Chikatilo and his calculated differences, and that machinery eventually arrived at the correct answer. The case of Konstantin Cheryomushkin has never achieved the global notoriety of Andrei Chikatilo. There are reasons for this, some historical and some structural. Chikatilo killed 52 people across more than a decade, operating in 3 Soviet republics, evading a manhunt that became one of the most discussed serial killer investigations in history. The scale of that case, the number of victims, the duration, the intensity of the investigation, the eventual capture and trial that became a media event even in the tightly controlled Soviet press, ensured that Chikatilo occupied a permanent and dominant place in the catalogue of Soviet horror. Cheryomushkin, by comparison, killed 4. 4, in the language of serial killer taxonomy, is the minimum threshold, 4 murders that each met the specific criteria of predatory, repetitive killing. But only 4 is the phrase that statistical thinking tempts us toward, and statistical thinking is precisely what the families of Svetlana Yefimova, Elena Gaeva, Tanya Klobuskina, and Oksana Yakovenko deserve to be protected from. There are no only 4. There are 4 human beings, each with an entire world inside them, each with people who love them, each killed in a specific place at a specific moment by a man who had decided their lives were his to take and their bodies were his to violate and mutilate. The fact that Cheryomushkin occupies a minor footnote to the Chikatilo story, literally earning the nickname Chikatilo's double, is itself a form of the invisibility he sought in life. He killed in the shadow. Even in death, in historical memory, he remains in the shadow. The monster he chose as cover became, posthumously, the framing through which the world understands him. There is an irony in that, and it is the specific irony of a man who thought himself cunning enough to be remembered on his own terms. He was not, for the investigators who worked the Betaysk murders. The men and women who had to separate 2 killers operating in the same region, who had to argue against the gravitational pull of the Lesopolosa investigation to insist that the Betaysk crimes were distinct. The resolution of the case was a professional achievement that came at considerable cost. Working in the shadow of Lesopolosa, with fewer resources, with the constant pressure of an investigation that dwarfed theirs, they had nevertheless followed the evidence where it led. The differences in profile, the car, the stolen valuables, the distinct pattern of mutilation, had eventually been enough to build a separate case. Cheryomushkin's arrest, confession, and sentencing validated that work. But there were also questions the case left open, the way all cases leave questions open, particularly those in which the perpetrator is executed before a complete psychological examination can build the fullest possible understanding of what produced him. What did the discovery of his father's infertility truly do to him? The specialist's assessment, that it deformed his psyche, is the broad professional shorthand for something that almost certainly unfolded in specific, textured ways over months and years. How did Cheryomushkin process that revelation in the privacy of his own mind? Did he tell anyone? Did he carry it in silence? Or did it escape in ways that those around him noticed but did not understand? Did the car thefts, those 2 early criminal convictions, represent a groping toward something that the murders later fulfilled more completely? The taking of things that were not his, the assertion of possession over objects that belonged to others. Does that trace a line, however crooked, to the man who stole from his dead victims as methodically as he killed them? These are questions for which the archived case files of a Soviet regional court, if they still exist in accessible form, would need to speak. And the Soviet system was not known for producing case files designed for future psychological analysis. What can be said with certainty is this: Cheryomushkin was a formed adult when he killed. He was not acting on the impulse of a single traumatic moment. He committed his first murder in 1986 and continued until 1989. 3 years, for murders, a sustained operational period that required maintenance, concealment, and the daily performance of normalcy in a community where people knew his face. That maintenance was not incidental. It was deliberate. The spoiled child who always got what he wanted had grown into a man who took what he wanted with lethal force and then drove home and parked his car and presumably slept. The town of Bataysk absorbed the case in the way that Soviet communities absorbed most officially acknowledged crimes, with a mixture of relief that the perpetrator had been caught, grief for the victims, and the complicated processing of a fear that had lived among them for 3 years without a face. When Cheryomushkin's face was finally attached to the crimes, the relief of identification would have been mixed, for his neighbors and acquaintances, with the specific vertigo of proximity. He had been among them. He had been a face on the street. He had offered rides. For the families of the 4 victims, the arrest and conviction answered the legal question while leaving the human question permanently unanswered. Why their daughter? Why Bataysk? Why these years, this man, this particular pattern of violence? The legal proceedings could establish that Cheryomushkin had done it. They could not give the families the specific human understanding that loss demands. The why that goes deeper than evidence. There is also the shadow of Chikatilo to consider, not just operationally, but in terms of what both cases together reveal about the Rostov Oblast in those years. 2 serial killers, the same region, the same approximate era. One became the most documented and discussed serial killer in Soviet and Russian history. The other died in relative obscurity, his crimes a footnote to a footnote. Both drew from the same cultural and geographic landscape: the industrial South, the Soviet provincial world, the specific social conditions of a system that was already fracturing internally even as it presented a face of ordered stability to the outside world. The question of whether Soviet society produced, or at minimum failed to detect, both of these men for longer than it should have is one that criminologists and historians have circled without fully resolving. The Soviet investigative system was powerful in certain ways. It had manpower, it had reach, it had the capacity to mobilize enormous resources toward a specific target when the political will existed. But it was also brittle in its thinking, hierarchical in ways that made lateral investigation difficult, and ideologically resistant to the idea that Soviet society could produce the kind of predatory psychopathology that the West attributed to capitalism and its discontents. Chikatilo's long career, over a decade of killing before he was finally caught, is the most famous indictment of those limitations. But Cheryomushkin's 3-year run, operating in the noise of the Chikatilo investigation, adds a second data point to the same argument. The system caught him ultimately, but it caught him at the cost of 3 additional victims beyond the first, and it caught him 4 years after the first killing. On February 14, 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed. In 1993, Konstantin Cheryomushkin had already preceded him to that same end, in the same city of Novocherkassk, with the same shot that the Soviet and then Russian state reserved for those it had determined could not exist alongside the living. The city of Bataysk today bears no particular monument to what happened within its boundaries between 1986 and 1989. The roads where Cheryomushkin drove are still roads. The outskirts where he committed his crimes are still outskirts, absorbed somewhat differently now into a town that has continued to exist and change in the 3 decades since. Svetlana Yefimova, Elena Gaeva, Tanya Klobuskina, and Oksana Yakovenko are names that appear in case files, in Wikipedia articles, in the taxonomies of serial killer databases maintained by people who document these histories so they are not lost. They deserve more than that. They deserve to be remembered as the specific, irreplaceable human beings they were. Young women who lived in Bataysk in the 1980s, who had no knowledge of the man watching them from behind the wheel of his car, who made ordinary decisions on ordinary days and were destroyed by a predator who had decided that the chaos of another killer's hunt was the perfect moment to begin his own. The nickname Chikatilo's double is, in retrospect, both accurate and misleading. Accurate in that Cheryomushkin operated in conscious parallel to Chikatilo, in the same region at the same time with superficially similar patterns of violence. Misleading in that he was not Chikatilo's shadow or copy or lesser version. He was his own killer with his own psychology, his own calculation, his own victims who were not collateral damage in someone else's story but the primary, devastating, irreversible center of his. He was the Bataysk maniac before he was called Chikatilo's double, the maniac of a satellite town that had no particular reason to produce him and no particular warning that it had. And then he was a dead man in Novocherkassk in 1993, his face turned toward a wall, his calculated cunning having eventually run out of road. He had driven many roads by then. He had driven young women down roads they could not return from. The road he met at the end was the only one he could not talk his way past, could not drive away from, could not plan his escape from with the cold intelligence he had always believed made him exceptional. The bullet did not care how cunning he thought he was. And in the silence that followed the shot in that Russian city in 1993, for names stopped waiting for justice. They had received the only justice the system could provide. Whether that is enough is a question every victim's family must answer alone, in the private dark of their own grief, in a language that no court filing has ever fully learned to speak. If you're new here, welcome. This is a channel where true crime is told with calm and care. A huge thank you to the subscribers who've been here from the start. Your support means everything. If you're still watching, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Or just say hello. And if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story. Now let's get into our second story. Story 2. The man next door was a monster. The chilling, decades-long murder trail of Tony Alvin Abels, a.k.a. the Violin Boy Killer. He once played the violin. He once smiled at neighbors. He once looked like someone's son. And that is precisely what made him so dangerous. There are killers the world never sees coming. Not because they hide in shadows, but because they stand in the light, smiling, breathing the same air as the rest of us, going to the same corner stores, living in the same apartments, sleeping beside the very women they would one day destroy. Tony Alvin Abels was that kind of killer. Not a stranger lurking in an alley. Not a face on a wanted poster circulating across state lines. He was a neighbor, a boyfriend, a man who had already served time for murder, been released, and then, without hesitation, without remorse, without missing a single beat, went right back to killing. And the most terrifying part? The system watched it happen. The law shook hands with him at the prison gate, handed him back his freedom, and turned away, while the women of St. Petersburg, Florida, paid with their lives. This is not a story about a monster hiding in the dark. This is a story about a monster hiding in plain sight. And by the time anyone figured it out, the body count had already climbed to 4, possibly more. Welcome to the case of Tony Alvin Abels. And once you hear what he did, you will never look at the man next door the same way again. St. Petersburg, Florida. A city of waterfront beauty, warm salt air, and sun-bleached neighborhoods that stretched endlessly in every direction. In December of 1954, in the middle of that sun-drenched world, a boy was born who would one day cast a long, dark shadow over everything those streets stood for. Tony Alvin Abels entered the world on December 28, 1954, one of 8 children in a household that, from the very beginning, was cracking under pressures most families never survive. The Abels home was not a peaceful one. The father was abusive. The weight of that violence pressed down on every child in that household, shaping the way they understood the world. Shaping, in particular, the way young Tony understood it. He learned early that rage was a tool, that power came from physical force, that those who were weaker could be made to bend. These were not lessons any child should absorb, but they were the ones his environment delivered daily, relentlessly, without apology. Then, somewhere in the early 1960s, when Tony was still a young boy, his mother did something that fractured whatever remained of the family's fragile structure. She left. She walked away from the abusive home, and in doing so, she also walked away from her 8 children, leaving them behind in the care of a man whose hands were a source of terror rather than comfort. The abandonment was not just emotional, it was foundational. It pulled the ground out from under a child who was already standing on unsteady terrain. To those who knew him in his earliest years, Tony Abels was described as outgoing, social, the kind of child who could hold a conversation and make people smile. He had a talent that seemed to contradict everything the streets around him represented. He played the violin. There was something almost heartbreaking in that detail, the kind of detail that makes people pause and wonder how something so different, so precise and tender and musical, could live inside a child who was simultaneously being shaped into something destructive. The violin required discipline. It required sensitivity. It required listening. And yet the world Tony Abels was growing up in was teaching him the opposite of all those things. By the time he was 13 years old, the fractures in his foundation had grown too wide to ignore. He began running away from home, not once, not twice, repeatedly. For months at a time, Tony would vanish from the family home, disappearing into the streets of St. Petersburg, navigating a world that had no real place for an angry, abandoned, unguided teenage boy. The streets, as they always do, filled in the gaps. They offered community of a kind, the wrong kind. They offered identity, belonging, survival logic. And they offered opportunity for those willing to take what they wanted rather than wait for what they needed. What followed was the trajectory of a life already tilting toward catastrophe. The question was never really whether Tony Abels would cross the line. The question, the one no one asked in time, was when. The answer came in 1970. Tony was 15, possibly 16 years old. The exact age would become a matter of legal significance. When he crossed a threshold from which there is no return, he committed his first known murder. It happened during a robbery in St. Petersburg, Florida. A man lost his life. The details of that man, his name, his face, his history, have largely been swallowed by time, which is itself a tragedy, because every victim in this story deserves to be remembered. What is known is that Tony Abels killed him, shot him, and in doing so, revealed something about himself that no amount of troubled childhood explanation could fully excuse. He was capable of ending a human life, and he had done it. He was arrested. He was brought before the courts. And in March of 1971, Tony Alvin Abels stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He was a teenager. The sentence handed down was life in prison. For many people, that phrase, life in prison, sounds permanent, final. The kind of consequence that closes a chapter and keeps it closed. But in the judicial reality of that era, a life sentence in Florida did not necessarily mean what the words implied. It meant, in practice, approximately 25 years. And so a child who had murdered a man in cold blood during a robbery would, after serving only 12 years, be released back into the world that had already proven it could not contain him. Those 12 years passed. The prison walls did their job of holding him, but they did not transform him. They did not reach into the parts of Tony Abels that were broken and repair them. Whatever anger lived inside him, Whatever compulsion toward violence had been forged in that abusive home and hardened on the streets of St. Petersburg, it survived incarceration unchanged. It waited. It learned patience. And when the gates finally opened in 1983 and Tony Alvin Abels walked out of state prison on parole, it walked right out with him. He was 28 years old. He had spent his formative years, the years when most people build relationships, develop character, learn accountability, inside a correctional facility. He emerged with a record that should have marked him as someone requiring intense supervision, ongoing mental health intervention, and careful monitoring. Instead, he found work. He got a job in construction, the kind of physical, demanding labor that filled his days with purpose and left his evenings open and unstructured. He found housing. He began, to outward appearances, to reintegrate. But outward appearances, as this story makes devastatingly clear, were never to be trusted when it came to Tony Abels. The parole board that released him in 1983 could not have known, could not have imagined, perhaps, just how quickly he would return to violence. They had processed his release with the tools available to them. They had weighed his years served, his guilty plea, his institutional record. They had made a decision, and they had been catastrophically wrong. Because Tony Alvin Abels had been free for exactly 5 months when he killed again. 5 months, not years, not even a full season. 5 months of freedom, 5 months of construction work, 5 months of building his life in the outside world. And then, on June 25, 1983, he walked into someone else's home and ended everything. The woman's name was Adeline McLaughlin. She was 83 years old. She was a retired widow living alone in her apartment in a downtown St. Petersburg retirement community. A woman who had lived long enough to see the world change many times over, who had earned the quiet of her later years, who posed no threat to anyone on earth. She was, in every meaningful sense, the most vulnerable kind of victim imaginable. Elderly, alone, female, trusting in the safety of her own home. Tony Abels broke into her apartment through a first-floor window. He moved through her space with intention. What happened next was not spontaneous or impulsive. It was calculated, brutal, and sustained. He sexually assaulted Adeline McLaughlin. He robbed her home of whatever he could carry. And then, to ensure she could not report what had been done to her, he smothered her with a pillow. He pressed the life out of an 83-year-old woman and left her apartment as quietly as he had entered it. Adeline McLaughlin died alone, in the place she had lived, at the hands of a man she had never met, a man who had served time for murder and been handed back to her city without adequate warning. The crime scene yielded physical evidence, biological material that investigators collected and preserved. But the technology to analyze that evidence in a way that would definitively identify Tony Abels did not yet exist. DNA profiling, as it would come to be understood, was still years away from common forensic use. The case went cold. The biological evidence sat in storage. Adeline McLaughlin's murder went unsolved for over 2 decades. And Tony Abels kept living. He kept working his construction job. He kept moving through the world with the face of an ordinary man. He had killed twice now, once as a teenager during a robbery, once as a parolee 5 months into his freedom. 2 people were dead at his hands, and he remained unaccountable for one of those deaths. He was not finished. The months and years after Adeline McLaughlin's murder saw Tony Abels continue his life in St. Petersburg. He formed relationships. He entered into romantic partnerships. And those partnerships, as the story would ultimately reveal, were not safe spaces for the women who entered them. There was something about the intimacy of a close relationship that, for Tony Abels, seemed to create a particular kind of danger. His victims were not strangers to him, not all of them. Some of them knew him, trusted him, shared space with him, and that trust, that proximity, became the very thing that made them vulnerable. The profile of Tony Abels that was beginning to emerge, though no one in law enforcement had yet assembled it into a complete picture, was one of a man who moved between worlds with ease. He could charm, he could connect, he could hold down employment and maintain the appearance of stability. And beneath all of that, beneath the smiling face and the everyday movements, the violence he carried never went quiet. It only waited for its next occasion. As 1983 turned into 1984, and 1984 moved toward the middle of the decade, Tony Abels remained a free man. He remained a parolee with a murder conviction who had now committed a second murder and faced no consequences for it. He was operating in a gap, a deadly gap between what the law knew and what the truth was. In that gap, he found his next victim. Her name was Deborah Kaiser. She was 31 years old. She was his girlfriend. And she would have no idea, as their relationship developed and deepened, that the man beside her had already killed twice, that he had smothered an 83-year-old woman in her own bed, that he had stood over a robbery victim in 1970 and taken a life without flinching. She knew Tony Abels the way most people knew him, as a person, not as a predator, as a partner, as someone she had chosen. That choice would cost her everything. By February of 1987, Tony Abels and Deborah Kaiser were in a relationship that had turned dark in ways the outside world could not fully see. Whatever tensions existed between them, whatever volatility had crept into the dynamic they shared, it reached its breaking point on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1987. A day the calendar marks as one of love and declaration. A day that became, for Deborah Kaiser, the last day of her life. She had last been seen the previous day, February 13th, making a phone call from a payphone outside an apartment building. That image, a woman at a payphone, an ordinary moment on an ordinary afternoon, was the last confirmed sighting of Deborah Kaiser alive. The next day, on Valentine's Day, Tony Abels sexually assaulted her and strangled her to death. He disposed of her partially clothed body in a wooded area near Roser Park in St. Petersburg, where it was discovered the following day by children who had come to the area to play. Children who found a body of a woman who had been violated and murdered by the man she had been dating. The case was investigated. Deborah Kaiser's death was treated as a homicide. But Tony Abels, despite being in a romantic relationship with her, was not immediately arrested or named as a suspect. The investigation did not connect him to her death at that time. Once again, he walked free. Once again, the evidence that could have identified him, biological material recovered from the crime scene, sat waiting for a technology that had not yet reached its full potential. Tony Abels moved on. He took up with other women. He continued working. He continued presenting himself as a man living an ordinary life. And the murders of 3 people, a robbery victim in 1970, an 83-year-old widow in 1983, a 31-year-old girlfriend in 1987, remained either officially unconnected to him or legally unpursued. He was, as far as the public record showed, a man who had served his time and rejoined society. The reality was something far darker, far more dangerous, and far closer to the edge of what human beings are capable of doing to one another. But the story was not over. Tony Abels was not finished, and the system that had failed to stop him was about to be given one more chance, one final, public, unavoidable chance, to look at the man it had created and reckon with what stood before it. That chance would come in 1990, and this time the witnesses would be right outside the door. There is a particular kind of horror that lives inside the word boyfriend. It is a word that implies safety, familiarity, chosen closeness. When a woman introduces a man as her boyfriend, she is telling the world, I know this person. I have looked at him and decided he is worth my trust. The word carries with it the weight of intimacy, of shared meals and shared mornings, of phone calls that run too long, and the particular comfort of someone who knows your name and reaches for your hand in public. For the women in Tony Abels' life, that word became something else entirely. It became a door that led, for some of them, to the last moments they would ever experience. The intimacy they had extended toward him was not returned. It was weaponized. The trust they had placed in him became the very mechanism of their destruction. Understanding Tony Abels requires understanding the women he moved through, not as footnotes to his story, but as the center of it. Because they were not peripheral to his crimes. They were not strangers caught in the wrong place at the wrong moment. At least 2 of his confirmed victims were women who had chosen to be close to him. Women who had, in the most human and ordinary way possible, decided that Tony Abels was someone worth knowing. Deborah Kaiser was one of them. She was 31 years old in 1987. A woman in the prime of her life, with a history and a face and a full world of experiences that existed entirely apart from the man who would end her. She had roots in Monterey, California, which tells us she was not a St. Petersburg native, that she had come from somewhere else, that her life had carried her across distances before landing her in the orbit of a man who had already killed twice. The details of how she and Tony Abels came together are not fully preserved in the public record. What is preserved is what happened to her. The last confirmed moment of Deborah Kaiser's life, the last time anyone who was not Tony Abels saw her breathing, was on February 13, 1987. She was at a payphone, outside an apartment building, making a call. That image carries a weight that is difficult to fully articulate. A woman standing at a public phone, doing something as unremarkable as making a call, with no knowledge that she was living out her final hours. Whatever she said into that receiver, whoever she called, whatever ordinary words passed between her and the person on the other end of the line, none of it could prepare her for what was coming. None of it could protect her. The following day was Valentine's Day, February 14th, the day that Tony Abels sexually assaulted and strangled her to death. The strangulation of a person is not a quick or clean act. It requires sustained, deliberate physical force. It requires the killer to remain in proximity to the victim, to hold, to press, to watch while life drains away. It is, by any measure, one of the most intimate forms of violence. And Tony Abels carried it out on the woman he was supposed to love, on the day the calendar assigned to declarations of affection, and then disposed of her body in the woods near Roser Park as if she were something discarded rather than someone destroyed. Her partially clothed body was found the next day. Found by children, in the kind of discovery that reshapes childhood in ways that never fully heal. The investigation that followed treated her death as the homicide it was, but it did not lead at that time to Tony Abels. He remained outside the circle of suspicion, even as the woman he had been dating lay in a morgue, even as her family and friends and the investigators who worked her case tried to understand what had happened to her on Valentine's Day in 1987. The evidence was there. It had been collected from the scene. It would eventually be the key that unlocked the truth. But in 1987, it was merely a piece of a puzzle that no one yet had the tools to complete. And so Deborah Kaiser joined Adeline McLaughlin in the category of Tony Abels' victims who did not receive justice in any time frame that could be called reasonable. Her murder remained officially unsolved. Her killer remained free. And the question of what he would do next remained, terrifyingly, an open one. 3 years passed. 3 years during which Tony Alvin Abels lived, worked, breathed free air, formed new relationships, and presumably told himself whatever a man like him tells himself in the quiet moments between the things he has done. 3 years during which the families of his victims waited for answers that did not come. 3 years during which the legal system that had released him after 12 years for a life sentence remained unaware, or perhaps simply unable to prove, that the man on parole in St. Petersburg had graduated from a teenage robbery killing into something far more methodical and far more vicious. By 1990, Tony Abels had a new girlfriend. Her name was Marlene Burns. She was 48 years old. She was also his roommate. They shared an apartment on Grove Street in St. Petersburg, one of those ordinary, unremarkable addresses that becomes impossible to forget once a crime has been attached to it. The apartment was a wooden, one-story structure, the kind of building that feels temporary, that carries the sounds of its residents through thin walls, that places neighbors in close enough proximity to hear arguments and movement and distress. What Marlene Burns and Tony Abels had together was, by multiple accounts, a relationship already marked by tension. The specific dynamics of their partnership are not exhaustively documented, but what is documented is that on June 4, 1990, they had been drinking, both of them together, through the course of the day. Alcohol running alongside unresolved conflict, resentment building in the heat of a Florida afternoon. The kind of slow escalation that moves from raised voices to something darker in increments that can seem, in retrospect, inevitable. At some point during that day of accumulated tension and alcohol, Marlene Burns did something that was, by any reasonable standard, an entirely ordinary thing. She left their apartment and went to visit someone in another unit within the same complex. She walked away from the argument the way people do when they need space, when the air in a room becomes too heavy to breathe, when distance feels like the only sensible option. She walked away. She went to another apartment. She perhaps thought that removing herself from the situation would defuse it, would give them both room to cool down, would make the evening survivable. Tony Abels followed her. He found her in that other apartment, and he did not come to talk. He did not come to apologize or negotiate or extend any gesture of reconciliation. He came with the violence that was already inside him, the violence that had been inside him since a robbery in 1970, the violence that had pressed a pillow over an 83-year-old woman's face, the violence that had strangled a 31-year-old woman on Valentine's Day 3 years earlier. He grabbed Marlene Burns and threw her down the stairs. 29 rib fractures. That number belongs in this story because it is not a number that can be understood abstractly. 29 broken ribs. To fracture even a single rib is an injury that produces pain severe enough to limit breathing, to make every inhale a battle. To fracture 29 of them, bones that form the cage protecting a person's most vital organs, is to subject a human body to a level of force that the imagination struggles to process. That is not an accident. That is not a moment of uncontrolled passion. That is sustained, repeated, deliberate violence inflicted on a body by a person who intended to destroy it. After throwing her down the stairs, Tony Abels was not finished. He went after her. He beat her. He kicked her. He stomped her. He continued the assault on a woman who had already suffered catastrophic injury, who was already in a state that most people would not survive, who had already paid an unbearable price for the simple act of walking away from an argument in her own apartment complex. He beat and kicked and stomped Marlene Burns until she was dead. And then he began to leave. He was walking away from the apartment when the witnesses saw him. He was wiping the blood off his hands. An act that, in its casual, mundane quality, is perhaps the most chilling detail in the entire scene. Not running, not hiding, wiping blood from his hands as he walked out, the way a person might wipe grease from their palms after working on a car, the way someone moves when they believe they are still in control of what comes next. The witnesses had already called the police. They had reported a domestic dispute. They had heard enough through the walls and the stairwell to know that what was happening in that building was not an ordinary argument, and they had made the call. When the police arrived, they found Tony Abels within reach. They arrested him immediately on the spot, in the parking lot or the walkway or wherever he was when the officers made contact. Standing there, blood on his hands, the woman he had just destroyed still lying where he had left her. He was charged with first-degree murder on June 6, 1990, 2 days after the killing. He was held without bail at the Pinellas County Jail. And for the first time in Tony Abels' long, destructive history, there was no ambiguity about what had happened. No missing evidence. No cold case. No waiting for technology that hadn't been invented yet. There were witnesses. There was blood on his hands, literally. There was a woman with 29 fractured ribs at the bottom of a staircase in their shared apartment building. The case against him was, in the most direct sense, as clear as a case can be. But clarity in evidence does not automatically translate to clarity in justice. The legal process that followed the arrest of Tony Alvin Abels for the murder of Marlene Burns would take time. It always does. And in the time it took for the courtroom procedures to unfold, for the dates to be set and the arguments to be assembled and the evidence to be formally presented, Tony Abels sat in a cell and waited. He had waited before. He had served 12 years once. He understood the rhythm of incarceration in a way that most people never have to learn. What he perhaps did not anticipate, what he could not have fully calculated, even with his particular experience of the legal system, was that science was catching up to him. Not in 1990, not yet, but the evidence from previous crime scenes was sitting in storage facilities, cataloged and preserved, waiting for a moment that had not yet arrived. The biological material recovered from Adeline McLaughlin's apartment in 1983. The material from the scene where Deborah Kaiser was found in 1987. Those samples were not destroyed. They were not lost. They were preserved, with the patience of institutions that understand that forensic capability is not static, that what cannot be proven today may become provable tomorrow. The trial for the murder of Marlene Burns proceeded through the machinery of the justice system. On January 30th, 1992, Tony Alvin Abels was convicted of her murder. The jury deliberated and returned with the weight of the evidence settled in their minds. Guilty. First-degree murder. And then they went further. They recommended the death sentence. That recommendation carried the voices of 12 people who had sat with the facts of what Tony Abels had done to Marlene Burns and decided that the appropriate response was execution. But the sentence was not theirs alone to determine. In Florida's system, a jury recommendation must be reviewed and confirmed or overridden by the presiding judge. And on May 11, 1992, Circuit Judge Bob Barker made a decision that would draw both support and criticism, depending on who was asked. He overrode the jury's death recommendation. He changed the sentence to life imprisonment. His reasoning was grounded in Tony Abels' mental health history, in the documented trauma of his childhood, in the assessment that the mitigating factors of his background, the abuse, the abandonment, the developmental disruptions, outweighed the aggravating factors that would otherwise have led to execution. Tony Abels would not be put to death. He would go to prison for life. And once again, the word life would carry with it a complexity that the average person, hearing it, might not fully grasp. Was life truly life this time? The question hung in the air. The answer would not be fully settled for years. What is certain is that Marlene Burns was dead. That her body bore 29 fractured ribs as testament to the violence Tony Abels had brought to the last moments of her life. That her family had been left to carry the grief of what had been taken from them. And that the man responsible was now behind bars, this time with more reason to believe he would stay there. But the story of Tony Alvin Abels was not finished. Not by a distance. Because the murders that the world did not yet know he had committed, the ones sitting in cold case files, attached to biological evidence that had not yet been fully analyzed, were waiting for their moment. Science was moving forward. DNA profiling was becoming what it would become. And the day was coming when the truth that Tony Abels had escaped for over 2 decades would finally find the words to speak itself aloud. There is something almost sacred about the way forensic science eventually renders the truth. It does not rely on memory, which fades. It does not rely on witnesses, who can be intimidated or incorrect or simply absent. It does not age, does not forget, does not negotiate. When a sample of biological material is properly collected and preserved, it carries within it a code, a precise biological signature that belongs to one person and no one else on Earth. DNA is not an approximation. It is not a best guess. It is, in the most literal scientific sense, a declaration of identity, written in the language of the human body itself. Tony Abels understood violence. He understood the streets. He understood the way institutions worked and how to move through them. What he did not understand, what he perhaps could not have predicted, back in 1983 when he entered Adeline McLaughlin's apartment, back in 1987 when he strangled Deborah Kaiser and left her in the woods near Roser Park, was that the biological evidence he left behind at those crime scenes would survive, that it would be stored, that the world would eventually develop the tools to read it, and that when those tools arrived, they would speak his name with perfect clarity. The year was 2006. Tony Alvin Abels was 51 years old. He had been in prison since 1990. He was serving a life sentence for the murder of Marlene Burns. He was, by any outward measure, already off the street, already contained, already confined, already paying for at least one of the crimes he had committed. But 2 other murders, 2 women who had died at his hands and whose cases had never been officially closed or officially solved, remained floating in a legal and investigative limbo that denied their families the resolution they deserved. Homicide detectives working the cold cases of St. Petersburg had not forgotten Adeline McLaughlin or Deborah Kaiser. Cold cases do not disappear simply because they go unsolved. They sit in files and in the memories of investigators who stay with them, who review the evidence periodically, who watch the evolution of forensic technology with a very specific kind of hope. When DNA profiling technology advanced to the point where it could extract meaningful identification from older, degraded biological samples, investigators began submitting evidence from unsolved cases to state databases for comparison. It was methodical work. It was the kind of work that does not make headlines when it begins, only when it produces results. In 2006, detectives submitted Tony Abel's DNA profile, drawn from his 1992 felony conviction, to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for comparison against biological evidence from unsolved cases in the Tampa Bay area. The results that came back were not ambiguous. They were not partial or inconclusive or suggestive. They were definitive. The semen evidence recovered from Adeline McLaughlin's apartment in 1983 matched Tony Alvin Abel's. The blood evidence recovered from the scene where Deborah Kaiser's body was found in 1987 matched Tony Alvin Abel's. 2 cases, 2 women, 2 sets of biological evidence that had waited in storage for 23 years in one instance and 19 years in the other. And at the end of that wait, a technology that did not exist when those women were killed delivered a verdict that the courts had not yet rendered. Tony Abels had been there. Tony Abels had done this. Tony Abels was not a man who had committed one murder in his youth and another in a drunken rage in 1990. He was a serial killer who had been operating in St. Petersburg for decades, preying on the women around him and on an elderly widow who posed no threat to anyone, and the law had simply not been equipped, or perhaps not sufficiently motivated, to stop him until it was far, far too late. On December 6, 2006, the St. Petersburg Police Department made a public announcement. They named Tony Alvin Abels, already imprisoned, already serving a life sentence, as the suspect in the murders of Adeline McLaughlin and Deborah Kaiser. They classified him at that moment formally and officially as a serial killer. The announcement landed in the city with the particular weight of revelations that forced people to reckon with what they did not know, what they perhaps should have known, and what the consequences of not knowing had been. For the families of Adeline McLaughlin and Deborah Kaiser, the announcement was not simply news. It was the arrival, after more than 2 decades, of an answer they had been denied. It was the moment when a name was attached to the violence that had been done to the women they loved. It was not justice, not yet, and for some of them not ever, given what the legal process would and would not ultimately deliver. But it was the truth, finally spoken aloud in public by the authorities who had the power to speak it. The legal implications of the DNA findings were, however, complicated. The existence of forensic evidence connecting Tony Abels to 2 additional murders did not automatically translate into 2 additional convictions. The path from scientific identification to courtroom judgment is neither straight nor short, and in this case it was particularly fraught. For the murder of Deborah Kaiser, prosecutors faced a complication rooted in the nature of the relationship between victim and perpetrator. Abels and Kaiser had been romantically involved at the time of her death. This fact, which should have been an aggravating element, the betrayal of a partner, the abuse of intimate trust, was instead used to justify a decision not to prosecute. Prosecutors determined that the prior romantic relationship made the case too complicated to proceed. No charges were filed in connection with Deborah Kaiser's murder. The case was officially classified as closed, meaning law enforcement accepted the DNA evidence as proof of what had happened, but declined to pursue a legal remedy for it. Her family was told, in effect, that the man who had sexually assaulted and strangled their loved one on Valentine's Day in 1987 would face no additional legal consequences for that specific act. The reasoning was institutional and prosecutorial, a calculation about what could be won in court versus what was already certain in evidence. But to the people who loved Deborah Kaiser, the word complicated as a justification for non-prosecution was its own kind of wound. Her death had been complicated. What had been done to her had been violent and terrible and intimate in the worst possible way. The simplicity they deserved, the sight of her killer standing trial for what he had done to her, was denied. For the murder of Adeline McLaughlin, the path was different. On March 16, 2011, nearly 5 years after the DNA announcement, Tony Alvin Abels was officially booked for the murder of the 83-year-old retired widow. A first-degree murder charge was formally attached to his record in connection with her death. The booking represented a legal acknowledgement that the system was prepared to pursue accountability for Adeline McLaughlin in a way it had declined to do for Deborah Kaiser. But the booking did not lead to a trial. As of the most recent available information, the charges in the McLaughlin murder have not proceeded to court. Tony Abels is what the legal system describes as detained in her death, meaning that should he ever become eligible for release from the life sentence he is serving for the murder of Marlene Burns, he would be held pending the unresolved McLaughlin charges. It is a legal mechanism that prevents his release without requiring the justice system to go through the full process of a trial for a man who is already imprisoned. It is, in its way, efficient, but it is not the same as a verdict. It is not the same as Adeline McLaughlin's name being spoken in a courtroom while a jury returns a guilty finding and a judge pronounces sentence. The DNA revelation of 2006 also prompted investigators to consider something that was perhaps not spoken loudly but was clearly present in the way they discussed the case. Tony Abels might have killed more than 4 people. Police Major Michael Poots, who spoke publicly about the case following the DNA announcement, indicated that there was a strong possibility Abels was responsible for additional crimes that had not yet been connected to him. This is a statement that serious investigators do not make casually. It is the kind of assessment that comes from looking at the documented pattern of someone's behavior, the frequency, the escalation, the opportunism, and recognizing that the known record may not be the complete one. The span of Tony Abels' known criminal activity ran from 1970 to 1990, 20 years. Within that span, for confirmed kills and the very real possibility of others, he had operated across multiple victim types. A man during a robbery, an elderly woman alone in her apartment, 2 girlfriends, demonstrating a capacity for violence that was not restricted by any particular preference for victim profile. He killed when opportunity and motive converged. He killed when he felt like it. He killed on Valentine's Day. He killed the day after he was released from prison on parole. He killed during drunken arguments and during premeditated break-ins. The pattern was not consistent in its circumstances, only in its outcome. By the time the 2006 DNA results were processed and the announcement was made, Tony Abels had already been in prison for 16 years for the Burns murder. He was middle-aged. He had lived within the confines of the correctional system long enough that his daily reality was defined by institutional routine rather than the Florida streets where he had once moved freely. The forensic reckoning that came for him in 2006 did not change the physical reality of his incarceration. He was already locked away, but it changed the legal and public understanding of who he was and what he had done. He was no longer a man who had committed 1 murder as a juvenile and 1 more in a domestic altercation in 1990. He was a serial killer, a man who had preyed on people across 3 separate decades, a man who had killed at 16 and had not stopped, a man who had been imprisoned, released, and then continued killing within 5 months of his release. A man whose crimes had remained invisible to the justice system not because he was particularly brilliant or careful, but because the forensic tools that would eventually identify him simply did not exist at the time he committed most of his murders. That is one of the most uncomfortable truths that this case forces into the light. Tony Abels was not a criminal mastermind. He was not an unusually sophisticated or intellectually formidable killer. He was a man with a violent disposition, an abusive history, and an instinct for predatory behavior who benefited enormously from the limitations of the forensic science of his era. Had DNA profiling been available and in routine use in 1983, the biological evidence from Adeline McLaughlin's apartment would have identified him immediately. He would have been returned to prison within months of his parole. Deborah Kaiser would likely still be alive. Marlene Burns would likely still be alive. The technology that eventually caught him also implicitly revealed the cost of its own absence. Every year between 1983 and 2006, 23 years, was a year in which the truth about Tony Abels existed in biological form in a storage facility, waiting to be read. The victims who suffered during that waiting period paid the price of a gap that science eventually closed, but closed too late to save them. This is not an argument against the investigators or the prosecutors of the 1980s and 1990s. They worked with what they had. Forensic science is not static, and the expectation that any era's investigators should have the tools of a future era is unreasonable. But the cost of that absence, measured in lives, is undeniable. And the knowledge that the evidence existed, untapped and unread, through all the years of Marlene Burns' relationship with Tony Abels, through the months that led to her murder in 1990, through the trial and sentencing and incarceration that followed, that knowledge carries its own particular weight. The DNA spoke, eventually. It spoke for Adeline McLaughlin, who had been smothered with a pillow in her own home at 83 years old. It spoke for Deborah Kaiser, who had been sexually assaulted and strangled on the day the world designates for love. It spoke their names and attached them, with scientific precision, to the man who had ended them. And it placed Tony Alvin Abels in the record where he belonged, not as a troubled man who had made two terrible mistakes, but as a serial killer whose crimes had spanned 2 decades and whose victims deserved far more from the justice system than they ultimately received. Tony Alvin Abels is currently incarcerated at South Bay Correctional Facility in South Bay, Florida. He is serving a life sentence without parole eligibility. He is, as of recent records, in his early 70s, a man who has now spent more years inside prison than he spent outside of it. The arc of his life, measured in the simplest terms, begins with a troubled childhood in St. Petersburg, accelerates into violence before his 16th birthday, and has ended, to the extent that a living story can end, inside a correctional institution from which no credible legal mechanism for release currently exists. The sentence he is serving is rooted in the 1990 murder of Marlene Burns, the conviction that came in January of 1992, and the life term that Circuit Judge Bob Barker imposed in May of that same year when he overrode the jury's death recommendation. That override, that decision to substitute life imprisonment for execution, has been a point of controversy in discussions of the case. The jury, after weighing the evidence and the arguments of both sides, believed that what Tony Abels had done to Marlene Burns warranted the death penalty. The judge believed otherwise. The judge's reasoning centered on mental health, on the documented trauma of Abels' childhood, on the abandonment by his mother, on the abuse inflicted by his father, on the developmental consequences of growing up inside that particular crucible of violence and instability. Mental health as a mitigating factor in criminal sentencing is one of the most genuinely contested spaces in the entire legal system. On one side of that debate are those who argue that understanding the origins of violent behavior, the childhood abuse, the abandonment, the institutionalization of a teenager who was never given the tools to build a healthy life, is not the same as excusing it, and that a justice system that ignores the causes of the behavior it seeks to punish will never address those causes effectively. On the other side are those who look at the 29 fractured ribs of Marlene Burns, at the smothered 83-year-old woman in her own apartment, at the strangled girlfriend left in the woods on Valentine's Day, and argue that the severity of those acts places them beyond the reach of mitigating circumstance. Both arguments contain truth. Neither resolves the fundamental tension between what it means to understand a person and what it means to hold them fully accountable. And in the specific case of Tony Alvin Abels, that tension is felt most acutely by the families of his victims, people who did not need to understand what had made him capable of murder. They needed someone to be held, permanently and unambiguously, responsible for it. The appeals process that followed the 1992 sentencing produced no relief for Tony Abels. No successful legal challenge has emerged in the decades since his conviction. The mental health arguments that reduced his sentence from death to life did not subsequently free him. The incarceration that began in 1990 with his arrest outside the Grove Street apartment, blood on his hands, witnesses watching, has continued without interruption. As of November 2025, no documented appeal or legal effort has resulted in any modification of his status. He is detained. He is, in the administrative language of the Florida correctional system, also held in connection with the pending charges in the murder of Adeline McLaughlin, the 2011 booking that formalized what the 2006 DNA evidence had already established. This detainer means that even if some extraordinary legal development were to create the possibility of release from the Burns sentence, Abels would not walk free. The McLaughlin charges would hold him. It is a legal safeguard built into a system that has, in this case at least, taken steps to ensure that the man who killed at least 4 people does not emerge from prison into the world again. But the question of what his incarceration means, what it accomplishes, what it fails to accomplish, is one that the families of his victims have had to live with for decades. Because incarceration, for all its legal finality, does not undo damage. It does not repair grief. It does not give back the years that were taken. It does not answer the questions that remain hovering over this case like unresolved weather. Chief among those questions is the one that investigators themselves have raised. How many people did Tony Alvin Abels actually kill? Police Major Michael Putz's statement that there was a strong possibility Abels was responsible for more crimes than those to which he had been connected was not made casually. It was the considered professional opinion of someone who had looked at the full picture of Tony Abels' history and recognized that the confirmed victims might represent only a fraction of the actual total. The documented span of his criminal activity ran from 1970 to 1990, 20 years, for confirmed kills, and a pattern of behavior rooted in a willingness to prey on the vulnerable, a capacity for sustained physical violence, and an ability to move through ordinary life without attracting the suspicion of law enforcement, that does not suggest a man who would have limited himself to the cases that were eventually proven against him. Cold cases from the Tampa Bay area during the 1970s and 1980s have not, to public knowledge, produced additional confirmed DNA matches linking Abels to further victims. But the absence of confirmed additional links is not the same as the absence of additional crimes. It may reflect the limits of evidence preservation from that era. It may reflect investigative resources directed elsewhere. It may simply reflect the fact that some of Tony Abels' crimes, if there were indeed more, did not leave behind the kind of biological evidence that DNA analysis could subsequently recover and match. The possibility of unknown victims is one of the most profoundly unsettling dimensions of any serial killer case. It means that somewhere, potentially, are families who lost someone during the years Tony Abels was free, who grieved and searched for answers and never found them, and who may be connected to the man now in South Bay Correctional Facility without ever knowing it. It means that the number 4 as a count of victims may be a floor rather than a ceiling. It means that the damage Tony Alvin Abels inflicted on the world around him may be even greater than what the official record shows. This is not speculation for its own sake. It is the honest confrontation with what the documented facts of the case suggest when examined carefully. A man who killed at 16, who was released after 12 years and killed again within 5 months, who killed a girlfriend 3 years after that, who killed another girlfriend 3 years after that, who operated for 20 years in the same general geographic region, whose MO included both premeditated home invasion and impulsive domestic violence, whose victims ranged in age from 31 to 83. That profile does not suggest a man who killed 4 times and rested between crimes. It suggests a man whose capacity for violence was ongoing and uncontained, whose known victims happened to be the ones connected to him through surviving evidence. The question of Deborah Kaiser deserves its own reckoning in this final section, because the decision not to prosecute her murder remains one of the most troubling aspects of the entire case. The official explanation that the prior romantic relationship made prosecution too complicated rests on a logic that, while perhaps legally defensible in the specific tactical sense, is morally difficult to accept. Kaiser was sexually assaulted. She was strangled. Her body was left in the woods. These facts were established through DNA evidence. The identity of the person who had done these things was confirmed scientifically, and the decision was made by prosecutors exercising their discretion not to bring that person to trial for what he had done to her. The romantic relationship between Abels and Kaiser was not a mitigating factor in the crime. It was, if anything, an aggravating one. An abuse of intimacy, a betrayal of trust so profound as to defy easy articulation. But prosecutorial discretion operates on different calculations than moral ones, and the decision was made that the case against a man already serving life was not worth the complexity of proceeding. Deborah Kaiser's case is, in the official record, closed. Closed without a trial. Closed without a verdict. Closed in a way that her family may have found deeply unsatisfying, in a way that the word closed could never fully capture, because what was closed was not the wound, only the file. The case of Adeline McLaughlin is unresolved in a different way. The charges were filed. The booking happened. The legal mechanism of detention is in place. but no trial has occurred. An 83-year-old woman was sexually assaulted and smothered to death in her apartment 5 months after the man who killed her was released from prison on parole. 5 months after the justice system made a decision that resulted directly, though not intentionally, in her death. And the man responsible has not stood trial for that specific killing. The charges exist. The evidence exists. The DNA is conclusive. And still no trial. This is not an accusation leveled at any specific prosecutor or court. The complexity of prosecuting additional charges against a person already serving life is real. Resources, timing, the legal strategy of an office trying to allocate limited capacity. These are institutional realities that exist separately from the moral reality of what Adeline McLaughlin's family deserves. But the gap between the institutional and the moral is precisely where the families of victims are left to exist. In that gap, with the knowledge that the truth is known, that the law has acknowledged it, and that the full accounting it implies has not been completed. What, then, does the case of Tony Alvin Abels ultimately reveal? What does it show us, beyond the specifics of his crimes and the failures and partial successes of the system that pursued him? It reveals the cost of a justice system that treats a life sentence as a finite term. Tony Abels was sentenced to life in prison in 1971 for the murder of a man during a robbery. He was released after 12 years. Within 5 months, he was killing again. That sequence, imprisonment, release, murder, is not an argument against rehabilitation as a concept. It is a specific, documented, catastrophic failure of risk assessment in a particular case, and it resulted in the deaths of people who might otherwise have lived. The parole board that released Tony Abels in 1983 did not make its decision intending harm. But the harm that followed was not unforeseeable given the nature of the crime for which he had been imprisoned and the absence of evidence that the impulses driving that crime had been meaningfully addressed. It reveals the extraordinary importance of evidence preservation. The biological material collected from Adeline McLaughlin's apartment in 1983, and from the scene of Deborah Kaiser's death in 1987, survived for over 2 decades in storage and ultimately spoke with scientific precision about who had been responsible for those deaths. If that evidence had been discarded, degraded, or lost, the murders of McLaughlin and Kaiser might have remained permanently cold. The practice of preserving forensic evidence from unsolved cases, of maintaining it with the understanding that the tools to analyze it will eventually improve, is not bureaucratic inertia. It is the only thing that gave those 2 women any measure of posthumous accountability at all. It reveals the way that intimate partner violence can be simultaneously the most visible and the most invisible form of danger. Deborah Kaiser and Marlene Burns were both in relationships with Tony Abels when they were killed. The people closest to him, the people who had chosen him, who shared space with him, who built their daily lives around the assumption of his basic humanity, were also the people most at risk from him. This is not unusual in the broader landscape of violent crime. It is, in fact, one of the most well-documented patterns in the study of homicide. But it remains one of the hardest truths to confront, because it disrupts the narrative of danger as something that comes from outside, from strangers, from the unfamiliar. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one whose name you already know. And it reveals something about the man himself, about Tony Alvin Abels, born December 28, 1954, in St. Petersburg, Florida, one of 8 children in a home that gave him pain instead of foundation. He was not born a killer. That much can be said with certainty because no one is. He was born a child. One who played the violin, who was described as friendly, who had a life ahead of him that could have gone in other directions. What shaped him, twisted him, and ultimately produced the man who smothered an 83-year-old widow and stomped a woman to death on Grove Street was a combination of forces. Abuse, abandonment, inadequate intervention, a justice system that released him too early and monitored him too little, that is both comprehensible and entirely insufficient as an excuse. Understanding what produced Tony Abels is not the same as forgiving him. It is not the same as diminishing the horror of what he did. It is, instead, the uncomfortable work of looking at a case that could have ended differently at multiple points and asking, what would it have taken? What intervention, what policy, what decision made differently by the parole board or the mental health system or the courts might have changed the outcome for Adeline McLaughlin, for Deborah Kaiser, for Marlene Burns? Those questions do not have clean answers. But they are the questions that a case like this demands, not because the answers will undo what was done, but because the failure to ask them guarantees that similar failures will follow. Tony Alvin Abels sits in South Bay Correctional Facility. He is, by all accounts, where he will remain for the rest of his natural life. The women he killed are gone. Their families carry what they carry. The cold cases that science eventually solved, and the one that remains legally unresolved, stand as a record of what happens when a man with violence at his core is given repeated opportunities to exercise it, and when the systems designed to prevent that are too slow, too limited, or too constrained by their own rules to stop him in time. This is the story of Tony Alvin Abels. It is not a story that ends with the satisfying closure of full justice delivered. It is a story that ends, as many true crime stories do, in the space between what was proven and what was real, between what was punished and what was done, between the living and the dead. It ends with a man in a Florida prison and with questions that the passage of time has not yet fully answered. It ends, as it must, with the names of the people who were lost. Adeline McLaughlin, 83 years old, smothered in her own home. Deborah Kaiser, 31 years old, strangled and left in the woods. Marlene Burns, 48 years old, beaten to death with 29 fractured ribs. And one unnamed man, killed during a robbery in 1970, whose life was the first Tony Abels ever took. Remember their names, because the system, in its own way, has struggled to do so consistently. And in the remembering, there is something that the legal proceedings could not fully deliver. A form of witness that does not expire, that does not require a courtroom, and that refuses to let what was done to them disappear quietly into the silence of cold files and closed cases. They were real, they mattered, and the man who ended them will die in prison, in a Florida facility far from the streets where he once moved freely, carrying the weight of what he did. Whether or not every file is marked closed, whether or not every charge finds its trial, whether or not the full number of his victims is ever known, the story of Tony Alvin Abels is over. The lives he took never will be. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Ghost with Two Names. This is the story of Edward James Adams, a.k.a. Eddie the Untouchable, the Prohibition Phantom of the Midwest. He was born with one name, lived under another, and died with the blood of 7 people on his hands, 3 of them sworn officers of the law. Picture this. A man stands before you, clean-shaved, charming, with the kind of smile that could convince a widow to hand over her life savings and thank him for the pleasure. He cuts hair for a living. He smells of pomade and cologne. Women adore him. Men want to drink beside him. And yet, behind those easy eyes sits something hollow. Something that feels nothing. Something that, within the span of just 14 months, will drag the entire Midwest into a nightmare so savage, so relentless, so deeply personal in its violence, that 9,000 people will stand in line, not to mourn him, but to stare at his corpse with a mixture of horror and profound, shuddering relief. This is not a ghost story, though it might as well be. This is the true and terrifying account of a man who was born William Joseph Wallace, buried as Edward James Adams, and feared across Kansas, Missouri, and Iowa simply as Eddie, the man no prison could hold, no lawman could stop, and no bullet could catch until the very last one did. Welcome to a story about charm weaponized, about violence worn like a second skin, about a killer who robbed banks in the morning, murdered men by nightfall, and somehow, impossibly, kept walking free. Until he didn't. Stay close, because once this story begins, it does not let go. There are places in the American Midwest where the wind blows so flat and so cold across the prairie that it feels like the land itself is trying to push people out. Hutchinson, Kansas in 1887 was exactly that kind of place. A stretch of dry earth, hard labor, and harder men. It was here, on a modest farm, that a boy entered the world under the name William Joseph Wallace on April 23, 1887. Nobody who knew that child as an infant could have imagined what he would become. But then, that is always the way, isn't it? The most dangerous people rarely announce themselves. His father died when the boy was still very young enough that the loss left a wound that never properly healed. His mother remarried, as widowed women of that era often had to, and the stepfather who arrived to fill that vacant space was not a man the boy ever accepted, respected, or tolerated. The resentment ran deep and early. It did not express itself through tears or pleading. It expressed itself through resistance, a cold, stubborn withdrawal from anything that resembled obedience or hard physical work. The farm life his stepfather represented, all soil and sweat and thankless toil under the Kansas sun, was precisely the life that young Wallace intended to escape. And escape it he did. Rather than breaking his back in a field, he turned to the barber trade. It suited him in ways that farming never could. Barbering required a certain finesse, a social ease, a way of leaning in close to people and making them comfortable while your hands worked near their throats. It was, in retrospect, an almost poetic occupation for the man he would later become. He learned the craft, polished it until it shone, and then packed whatever he owned and moved to Wichita in the early years of the 20th century. A young man with clever hands, a magnetic personality, and absolutely no intention of living honestly. Wichita in those years was not the quiet plain city it might sound like. It buzzed with the kind of low-level lawlessness that always thrives on the edges of respectable society. And it was here, in those clattering, gaslit streets, that William Joseph Wallace met a man named John Callahan. Callahan was a bootlegger, resourceful, well-connected, and deeply uninterested in the law. For a young man already leaning toward the criminal edge, meeting Callahan was like tossing a lit match into a barn full of dry hay. Everything accelerated. Almost immediately, Wallace, who had by now begun using the name Edward James Adams, a name he would carry to his grave, slid into bootlegging, petty robberies, and car theft. He discovered quickly that he had a gift for criminal enterprise that went far beyond the ordinary. He was handsome, genuinely, disarmingly handsome, with a natural charisma that drew people in and made them drop their guard without realizing it. Women were particularly drawn to him, and he collected admirers the way other men collected debts. He married at some point during these years, but his wife eventually grew exhausted of the infidelities, the danger, the constant shadow of law enforcement at the door, and she left him. He was unbothered. There were always others. He formed his first gang during this period and began stretching his criminal reach outward through Kansas, Missouri, and Iowa. Banks, general stores, quiet towns where nobody expected a man of his caliber to arrive. He moved with a calculated boldness that was almost theatrical, as though the crime itself were secondary to the performance of it. By the time the United States entered Prohibition in 1920, Eddie Adams had established himself as the most feared outlaw operating across the Midwestern plains. Law enforcement knew his name, citizens whispered it, and yet catching him remained, time and again, an exercise in frustration. The year 1920 is where the full unraveling darkness of this story begins. Not with a whisper, but with a gunshot. By that autumn, Adams had linked up through John Callahan with a pair of brothers, Ray and Walter Majors, both of them seasoned criminals with no particular objection to violence. Together, on the 5th of September 1920, the group set their sights on a target that most men would have considered suicide. An illegal gambling den on Grand Avenue in Kansas City, Missouri, owned and operated by a man named Harry Tristel. This was not some timid backroom card game. Tristel's establishment was guarded by hard, dangerous men who had not survived in the criminal underworld by being gentle. But Adams and the Majors brothers walked in anyway, guns in hand, confidence radiating off them like heat from asphalt. What followed was not a clean robbery. It was a war. The gambling den's employees, gamblers and gunmen themselves, returned fire with the kind of ferocity that only men with nothing particularly legal to protect could muster. When the smoke cleared and the noise died, a man named Frank Gardner, a gambler and gunman who had drawn his weapon in the chaos, lay dead. The robbery had collapsed into catastrophe. Police responded, and Adams, along with the Major's brothers and other associates, was swept up in the aftermath. He was arrested, tried, sentenced. In February 1921, a Missouri court handed Edward James Adams a life sentence for the murder of Frank Gardner. It was the kind of sentence designed to be permanent, to remove a man from the world and press him under the weight of iron bars until the world forgot he had ever existed. But the world was about to be reminded, violently, that Edward James Adams had no intention of staying anywhere he didn't choose to be. While being transferred in custody to the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City, Adams made his first escape. He simply jumped from the transport, not in a dramatic Hollywood fashion, but with the quiet, purposeful execution of a man who had been planning the moment since before the handcuffs were locked. He was gone before the officers properly understood what had happened. Within days, rather than disappearing into anonymity as a wiser fugitive might have done, Adams resurfaced in Cullison, Kansas, partnering with a man named Julius Finney for the robbery of both a bank and a general store on February 11, 1921. The audacity was staggering. The man had just walked away from a life sentence for murder, and his first free act was to rob 2 establishments in broad daylight. He was captured again 6 days later, on February 17th, near Garden Plain, Kansas, after a stolen car he was driving crashed under a bridge. Posse closed in. He was taken. This time, the Kansas courts added to his burden. Convicted of bank robbery, he received a sentence of 10 to 30 years at the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, on top of the life sentence already waiting for him in Missouri. 2 sentences, 2 states, no future outside those walls. Or so the authorities believed. On August 13, 1921, Eddie Adams proved them all catastrophically wrong. In an act of criminal ingenuity that would become the stuff of Midwestern legend, Adams sabotaged the prison's power plant, plunging the facility into darkness. In that engineered blackout, he scaled the prison wall, not alone, but with 3 other inmates: Frank Foster, George Weisberger, and a man named D.C. Brown. Waiting for them outside the walls in a getaway car sat Billy Fintelman, a World War I veteran who had traded the trenches of Europe for the back roads of Kansas and decided he preferred the latter. D.C. Brown was recaptured within days. The others were not. The reformed Adams gang was now operational, and it had a grudge to work through. What followed across the next several weeks was a rampage that moved through the Kansas countryside with terrifying speed. In September 1921, the gang descended on banks in Rose Hill and Hayesville, Kansas, clearing approximately $10,000, a substantial sum for the era. But it was during the Hayesville robbery that something occurred which stripped away any remaining pretense that Eddie Adams was merely a clever criminal chasing money. During the course of that robbery, Adams encountered an 82-year-old man named James Creeville. There was no logical reason to harm this man. He posed no threat. He had no gun. He was 82 years old. And yet Adams took the butt of his pistol and beat him, savagely, without pause, without apparent motive. James Creeville suffered a fractured skull from that beating. He later died from his injuries. 7 people would ultimately die at the hands or direct actions of Edward James Adams. James Creeville was among them, an old man beaten to death simply because he was present and because Adams, in that moment, chose violence for its own sake. That is the detail that separates the calculating criminal from something far more disturbing. That is the moment where the performance of daring falls away entirely and what remains underneath is something cold and cruel and completely indifferent to human life. The gang kept moving. They were not finished. Not remotely. Law enforcement throughout Kansas was by now in a state of agitated alarm. The Adams gang had escaped prison, robbed multiple banks, and killed an old man with their bare hands. Posses were organized. Tips were followed. On October 8, 1921, police attempted to lay a trap for the gang near Onally, Kansas. Failed. The gang detected or avoided the ambush and broke through after a gunfight that left Deputy Benjamin Fisher wounded but alive. Adams and his men vanished again into the sprawling flatlands, moving with the kind of practiced invisibility that comes from knowing the landscape intimately and having absolutely no hesitation about shooting anyone who gets in the way. Days passed. The gang surfaced again, this time in Iowa. Near Osceola, they robbed a bank of $500 in silver. It was not their largest haul, but it kept them moving, kept them funded, kept them free. Then, just south of Murray, Iowa, another confrontation. A local farmer named Charles William Jones had spotted the gang's vehicle parked along a gravel road and recognized that something was wrong. He contacted Murray's Sheriff Ed West, and a group was assembled to investigate. When Sheriff West approached the vehicle, he found himself staring down the barrel of Adams' revolver from point-blank range. The gun misfired. By the grace of that single mechanical failure, Ed West survived. He dove for cover, and a fierce gun battle erupted between the posse and the gang. Charles Jones, hearing the shooting from his farm up the road, did not hide. He grabbed his shotgun and ran toward the sound of the fight. He ran toward the danger because that is the kind of man he was. The gang, having broken away from the initial confrontation, drove their vehicle directly toward him. There was a brief, violent exchange of gunfire along that Iowa road, and Charles Jones fell. Mortally wounded by the Adams gang, the farmer who had tried to do the right thing died for it. The bodies were beginning to accumulate, and the worst was yet to come. The autumn of 1921 descended on the Midwest like a slow-falling curtain, the kind that dims the light gradually until you realize the room has gone completely dark and you don't quite know when it happened. Eddie Adams and what remained of his gang were somewhere inside that darkness, moving, always moving, never settled in one place long enough for the law to properly grip them. They swept through towns like a bad season, destructive, unpredictable, and gone before the damage could be fully assessed. After leaving Iowa with Charles Jones dying in their wake, the gang returned to Kansas with an energy that bordered on mania. They hit Muskota. Not one store, not two, but 11 establishments robbed in what must have felt to the townspeople like an invasion rather than a crime. 11 businesses. The brazenness of it was almost incomprehensible. Adams moved through that town as though law enforcement were a minor inconvenience rather than an active, desperate pursuit. The confidence was not recklessness, or rather, it had evolved beyond recklessness into something resembling a genuine belief that he was untouchable. That no cell could hold him, no posse could catch him, and no bullet had his name on it. He would be proven wrong. But not yet. On the outskirts of Wichita, the gang encountered 2 motorcycle police officers. Rather than flee or avoid contact, Adams and his men did what had become their default response to any obstacle. They confronted it with overwhelming force. The 2 officers were abducted at gunpoint, robbed, and then left stranded as their motorcycles. Their only means of pursuit or communication were set ablaze. The image of those 2 burning motorcycles on the edge of Wichita is almost symbolic of the contempt Adams held for law enforcement. He wasn't just evading the police. He was humiliating them, sending a message written in smoke and scorched metal. That contempt would reach its most personal expression on November 5, 1921. Back in Wichita, Adams crossed paths with a patrolman named A.L. Young. The details surrounding the specific circumstances of their encounter carry a particular ugliness, because the motive behind what followed was not robbery. It was not self-preservation. It was not tactical necessity. According to accounts from those close to Adams at the time, there existed a shared romantic interest between the 2 men, a woman who had, in the end, made her preference clear by choosing the company of the officer over the outlaw. For a man of Adams' ego, for someone who had spent his adult life accumulating admirers the way other men accumulated possessions, this rejection was apparently intolerable. On November 5th, Adams shot and killed patrolman A.L. Young in cold blood. Young was a police officer on duty doing his job. He died not because he was standing between Adams and a robbery, not because he was closing in on an arrest, but because he had, in some private arrangement of the heart, been chosen over Eddie Adams by a woman. The killing was personal. It was petty in the most lethal possible sense of the word, and it announced to anyone still paying attention that whatever remained of reason or restraint inside Edward James Adams had eroded down to nothing. He was now killing for pride. 3 officers would die before this was over. Young was the first. Almost immediately after the murder of Patrolman Young, As though the act of killing had sharpened rather than dulled his appetite for action, Adams and his gang executed what would become their single most profitable criminal act. They hit a Santa Fe Express train near Ottawa, Kansas, and walked away with $35,000. $35,000 in 1921 money, a sum that, in today's terms, would represent extraordinary wealth. The robbery was clean, fast, and devastating to the railway company's coffers. The Adams gang had now proven themselves capable of murder, prison escape, multi-state bank robbery, and successful train heist. They were, in the worst possible sense, professionals. That money should have been their exit. $35,000 was more than enough to disappear, to cross into a distant state, assume new identities, and vanish into the American sprawl. A smarter man would have gone. A man with any portion of his survival instinct intact would have recognized that Wichita was now the most dangerous place on earth for Eddie Adams, and put as many miles between himself and it as possible. Adams stayed. He stayed because Wichita was where he was known, where he had associates, female companionship, a world he understood. And perhaps somewhere beneath the arrogance, because some part of him was no longer entirely invested in survival. The violence had become the point. The running was the point. Whatever this was, this life he had built from crime and blood and burned motorcycles and dead old men, it had its own terrible momentum now, and he seemed content to ride it wherever it led. It led, on the evening of November 20th, 1921, to the moment that sealed his fate. That night, Adams was in a vehicle with Frank Foster, a local woman named Nellie Miles, described in records as a madam and longtime acquaintance of Adams, a man named George McFarland who operated in Wichita's bootlegging circles, and two other women whose names history has not preserved. Billy Fintelman, Adams' loyal getaway driver and fellow prison escapee, was in a second vehicle behind them with his wife, George Weisberger, a man named P.D. Orcutt, and two more unnamed women. Both cars were moving at speed through the Wichita streets, not fleeing, not executing a plan, but joyriding with the careless confidence of people who believe themselves beyond consequence. Two motorcycle officers spotted the vehicles and moved to pull them over. In the moments that followed, a shot was fired from inside Adams' car. Who pulled the trigger, Adams or Foster, has never been definitively established. What is known without any ambiguity is the outcome. Patrolman Robert Fitzpatrick was killed, 2 officers dead, and the night was not finished. The cars scattered. The women were released somewhere south of the city as the men fled into Cowley County. Eventually, fuel ran out on a dark stretch of Kansas road, and Adams, Foster, and McFarland found themselves at a farm. Adams needed a vehicle. The farm had one. The farmer who owned it, a man named George Oldham, was present. George Oldham resisted. Adams shot him dead. 3 civilians killed. 3 officers killed. 7 total human beings, stripped of their futures by a man who was born William Joseph Wallace on a farm in Hutchinson, Kansas, and who had spent 34 years constructing one of the most violent criminal careers the American Midwest had ever witnessed. After killing George Oldham and stealing his car, Adams and Foster drove back toward Wichita. McFarland, apparently deciding that his association with Eddie Adams had become more dangerous than the law itself, slipped away alone into the dark Kansas night. The following day, Adams and Fintelman went to McFarland's house looking for him. What they found instead were 2 police officers who had been tipped off and were waiting. Adams drew his weapon and shot Officer Ray Kasner, wounding him. The second officer, rather than presenting himself as a target, hid, literally concealed himself beneath a piece of furniture, while Adams calmly walked back out and disappeared again. A wounded officer behind him, a hidden officer beneath a bed. Eddie Adams, strolling out of yet another police confrontation without a scratch. The manhunt that followed was the most intense the Wichita Police Department had ever mounted. The city was, in the truest sense of the word, terrified. 3 of their officers were dead. Adams was somewhere inside the city. They were almost certain of that, and every hour he remained free was an hour in which another officer might not go home. The department pulled resources from everywhere. Tips flooded in. The net was tightening. even if Adams couldn't yet feel it closing around him. He was hiding now, moving between safe houses, keeping a low profile in a way that was absolutely contrary to his nature but absolutely necessary to his survival. The charm, the swagger, the theatrical confidence. All of it compressed down to something quiet and watchful while the city outside turned its full attention toward finding him. But the instincts that had served him for 14 months, the criminal instincts, the survivor's awareness, the perpetual reading of situations and exits, were beginning to miscalculate. The net was genuinely tightening, and Adams was about to make one final catastrophic error in judgment. There is a particular kind of psychology that develops in men who have operated outside the law for long enough that they begin to believe in their own mythology. They have escaped prison twice. They have walked through police cordons. They have survived gunfights and posses and long pursuits across multiple states. And each survival compounds the irrational but deeply felt conviction that they simply cannot be stopped. That they are, in some fundamental way, different from ordinary men. That the rules, including the final mortal rule, do not apply to them. Eddie Adams, by November of 1921, had every reason to believe his own myth. And that belief was precisely what was going to destroy him. He was hiding in Wichita. He knew the city well, knew its people, its rhythms, its loyalties. He had allies scattered through its underworld. Women who sheltered him, bootleggers who fed him information, fringe figures who owed him favors accumulated over years of criminal partnership. The police were everywhere, yes, but Wichita was also a city with enough shadow in its corners that a resourceful man could stay hidden, at least for a while. The problem was time. Adams had committed his last murder on November 20th, and by November 22nd, the city was operating under something close to martial intensity. Officer Fitzpatrick's funeral was scheduled for that day, and Adams had correctly calculated that the police presence would shift, that officers who might otherwise be watching streets and staking out addresses would instead be gathered in mourning at the funeral service. It was not an unintelligent observation. He intended to use the funeral as cover. He planned to rent a vehicle during those hours and use the reduced street presence to drive out of Wichita, out of Kansas, out of the life he had built and the catastrophe it had become. He had the money. He had the network. He had $35,000 from the Santa Fe train robbery to put distance between himself and everything that had happened. All he needed was transportation. He went to a garage. The proprietor of that garage recognized him. This is the detail that unravels everything. Not a shootout, not a tactical failure, not a tip from a rival criminal. A garage owner who knew his face. A garage owner who, rather than confronting Adams directly or doing anything that might trigger the violence everyone now knew Adams was capable of, quietly stepped away and contacted police while Adams waited, unaware, somewhere inside the building. 3 officers arrived. What followed happened fast. The way violence always happens when it finally catches someone who has been running from it for too long. Adams drew his weapon. He fired. Detective Charles Hoffman, a career officer who had been part of the department's desperate push to bring Adams down, was hit. He had managed to pull Adams to the ground before the bullet found him. A final, courageous act from a man who knew exactly who he was dealing with. Officer Charles Bowman was also struck by gunfire in the chaos of those seconds. And then, from behind a pillar, a police officer named D.C. Stuckey stepped out. 3 shots. 3 bullets placed with the precision of a man who had trained for exactly this kind of moment, finding exactly the target that needed to be stopped. Edward James Adams, born William Joseph Wallace, April 23, 1887, in Hutchinson, Kansas, fell to the ground of a Wichita garage on November 22, 1921, at the age of 34. It was over, but the story did not end there. Not immediately. Because what happened to Adams' body in the hours following his death tells us something important about the impact his reign of terror had carved into the community around him. His corpse was taken to the city undertaking parlor in Wichita and publicly displayed. This was not an accident or an oversight. It was deliberate, a civic announcement that the man was genuinely, verifiably dead. After months of escapes and shootouts and impossible survivals, the city of Wichita needed to see the proof. And see it they did. More than 9,000 people passed through that parlor to look at the body of Eddie Adams. 9,000 people who had lived under the shadow of his violence, who had heard the reports of each new killing and robbery and escape and wondered, with genuine dread, where he would surface next. 9,000 people who needed to know with their own eyes that it was finished. Detective Charles Hoffman, who had been fatally wounded in the final confrontation, did not survive to see those 9,000 people file past. He died of his injuries, the third and final officer to lose his life in direct connection with Eddie Adams. Added to his death toll were Patrolman A.L. Young, murdered over a romantic slight. Patrolman Robert Fitzpatrick, shot during the November 20th joyride. Farmer Charles Jones, killed in Iowa for running toward the sound of gunfire to help a sheriff. Farmer George Oldham, killed for refusing to give up his car. And 82-year-old James Creville, beaten to death with a gun handle during a bank robbery in Hayesville, Kansas, for no articulable reason whatsoever. 7 lives, 14 months, 2 prison escapes, multiple states, an entire region held in suspended terror by one man with a gun and no meaningful boundary between desire and action. In the aftermath of Adams' death, 18 people connected to his operation were arrested as accomplices and associates. The sprawling network of individuals who had sheltered him, driven for him, carried messages, provided safe houses, and looked away from what they knew he was doing. Of those 18, 4 received sentences to the Kansas State Penitentiary. Frank Foster, who had been in the car the night Fitzpatrick was killed and had been Adams' close companion through the final weeks of the spree, received a life sentence of his own. The Majors brothers, Ray and Walter, who had been present at the original gambling den robbery in Kansas City that started all of this, both died in prison. The third Majors brother, Dudley, who had fled the scene of that first robbery, was eventually arrested and served time in Delaware. Julius Finney, who had partnered with Adams for the Cullison Bank robbery during his first escape from custody, had been captured and processed through the legal system earlier in the year. Billy Fintelman, the World War I veteran turned getaway driver, was taken in the wake of Adams' death and faced charges for his extensive participation in the gang's crimes. The entire apparatus, the network of violence and loyalty and criminal enterprise that Eddie Adams had assembled and operated with such brutal effectiveness, came apart almost immediately after his body hit the floor of that Wichita garage. Without Adams at the center, without his magnetism, his leadership, his willingness to do what other men hesitated at, there was nothing to hold any of it together. He had been the engine of it, and the engine had stopped. When a story ends in blood and the body count has been tallied and the accomplices have been processed and the city exhales its long-held breath, there is always a question that lingers in the silence after the noise. Not the procedural questions, those get answered in courtrooms and coroner reports. The deeper question, the one that doesn't fit neatly into a case file. How does a man become this? Edward James Adams was not born violent. Children raised on farms in Kansas in 1887 were not, as a rule, destined to become spree killers who held entire states hostage. The violence that defined the last 14 months of his life was constructed, brick by brick, over decades of choices. Some made consciously, some made by default, and some made by the kind of circumstance that shapes a person before they're old enough to understand what's happening. His father died while he was a child. This is not an excuse, it is a fact. The loss of a parent early in life creates a specific kind of wound, particularly in boys who grow up in an era and environment where grief has no language and vulnerability is not permitted. His mother remarried. The stepfather who entered that household was someone Adams despised with a consistency that lasted his entire life. A resentment so deep and so fixed that it hardened into a general contempt for authority that nothing ever successfully softened. He disliked physical labor. This sounds trivial until you consider the context. A boy on a Kansas farm in the late 1800s who refuses the work that defines his world has already decided, at a foundational level, that the rules governing everyone around him do not apply to him. That refusal, that early, stubborn exemption he claimed for himself from the demands of ordinary life, was the first and perhaps most decisive crack in whatever normal trajectory might have been available to him. He learned barbering. He moved to Wichita. He met John Callahan. And at each of these junctions, the direction of his life bent a little further from the straight and a little closer to the criminal. Meeting Callahan was not, in itself, fatal. Plenty of men in Prohibition-era Kansas knew bootleggers and never picked up a gun. The difference with Adams was not his circumstances but his appetite. For excitement, for easy money, for the particular thrill that comes from existing outside the boundaries everyone else respects. He was drawn to that life with the specific enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for permission to stop pretending. The charm was real. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of his character, because charm in a dangerous person is not a contradiction. It is a tool. Adams genuinely possessed the kind of magnetism that attracts people without effort. Women fell into his orbit readily and often. Men wanted to associate themselves with someone who seemed to move through the world with such self-assurance. That magnetism allowed him to build and rebuild his gang multiple times, to acquire shelter and loyalty and information from people who might have known better but were drawn in any way by proximity to someone who seemed so certain of himself. His wife left him. Even she, presumably more familiar with his actual nature than anyone, eventually reached a limit. His criminal activities and his repeated infidelities wore through whatever attachment she had, and she walked. He didn't pursue her. He moved on, as he always moved on, forward, faster, deeper into a life that had no reverse gear. The robbery of Harry Tristell's gambling den in September 1920 is the clearest before and after line in Adams' story. Before that night, he was a criminal, a robber, a bootlegger, a thief of cars, and an evader of law. Dangerous, certainly, but operating below the threshold of violence that would eventually define him. The gambling den robbery introduced death into the equation. Frank Gardner died in that shootout, and with Gardner's death came Adams' first murder conviction and life sentence. Most men, upon receiving a life sentence at 33 years old, would begin the grinding process of accepting their situation. Adams immediately began planning his exit. The escape from custody during his transfer to Missouri State Penitentiary was audacious almost beyond comprehension. He jumped from a moving transport, not a slow-moving vehicle, a transport, and rather than treating that escape as a gift to be used wisely, he used it immediately and recklessly, robbing a bank and general store within days of regaining his freedom. He was caught again within a week, sentenced again, sent to Kansas State Penitentiary under a second crushing sentence. And then the prison power plant went dark and the walls came down and he was free again. The pattern is clear in retrospect, though it must have been maddening to law enforcement in real time. No consequence reached Adams with sufficient weight to alter his behavior. Life sentence, he escaped. Bank robbery sentence, he escaped again. Recapture meant nothing to him. It was simply a temporary inconvenience between crimes. The system designed to punish and contain people like him had failed twice, and each failure made him more convinced that the rules truly did not apply to him. After the second escape, the violence intensified. James Creeville beaten to death for being present in the wrong bank at the wrong moment. Charles Jones killed for the crime of civic courage. George Oldham killed for the crime of owning a car Adams wanted. And the three officers, Young, Fitzpatrick, Hoffman, killed at different moments for different reasons, but all connected by the same thread. Adams encountered an obstacle and chose elimination over detour. The murder of Patrolman Young deserves particular examination because of what it reveals. The romantic motive, killing a police officer because a woman chose him over Adams, is not the act of a man who fears consequences. It is the act of a man so thoroughly enclosed within his own ego that the external world has become largely irrelevant except as it relates to his own desires and frustrations. Young didn't represent the law to Adams in that moment. He represented personal insult. And personal insult, in Adams' world, was apparently justification for a bullet. This is the quality that separated Adams from the merely criminal and placed him somewhere more disturbing. He had no meaningful threshold. Between feeling something and acting on it, there was no pause, no calculation, no concern for the humanity of the person standing in front of him. The 82-year-old bank customer, the farmer running toward the gunfire, the officer who chose the wrong woman. Each of them encountered Adams at a moment when he wanted something, and each of them died for it. The Santa Fe train robbery, executed in the weeks following Young's murder, was the peak of the gang's criminal achievement. $35,000 taken from a moving express train. It should have been the end. The money was enough to disappear. The circumstances were desperate enough to demand it. Adams stayed in Wichita anyway, joyriding through city streets with a car full of associates on the night of November 20th, as though he had already forgotten or stopped caring about the enormous machinery of law enforcement now directed entirely at finding him. The November 20th joyride that killed Patrolman Robert Fitzpatrick was not a planned action. It was carelessness. A motorcycled officer pulling over a vehicle, a gunshot from inside that vehicle, and a dead policeman on the Wichita street. Whether Adams or Foster fired the shot remains historically unclear. What is clear is that Adams was present, that he fled, and that his subsequent actions, killing George Oldham for his car, shooting Officer Kasner the following day, made any question of degrees of culpability largely academic. By the time Adams settled in to wait out the funeral of Fitzpatrick on November 22nd, using the department's grief as cover for his escape plan, he had 7 deaths behind him and a city that was beyond frightened. A city that was angry in the specific, clarifying way that communities become angry when violence has gone on long enough that it stops being shocking and starts being personal. The garage owner who recognized him and called police made an act of courage that is easy to overlook in the drama of what followed. Adams was a man known for his willingness to kill without hesitation. Alerting police to his presence required the garage owner to remain calm enough and brave enough to make that call without revealing to Adams that anything was wrong. Without that act, Adams might very well have driven out of Wichita with his $35,000 and vanished into whatever future was waiting for him elsewhere. Instead, 3 officers arrived. Adams fired. Hoffman was pulled to the ground and shot. Bowman was hit, and D.C. Stuckey, positioned behind a pillar, ended it with 3 shots. 9,000 people at the city undertaking parlor. 9,000 citizens who needed to stand in front of that body and confirm with their own eyes what their hearts were still having trouble accepting, that the man who had terrorized their city, killed their officers, beaten an old man to death, and escaped from custody twice was genuinely, finally, irreversibly gone. The legal aftermath took months to resolve fully. 18 arrests, for prison sentences for accomplices. Frank Foster, sentenced to life. A man who had been present for multiple crimes and who some believed had fired the shot that killed Fitzpatrick, though this was never conclusively proven in court. Fintelman, the veteran-turned-criminal, processed through a system he had spent nearly a year helping Adams evade. The women, the bootleggers, the hangers-on, all of them separated from the gravity of Adams' presence and suddenly very exposed without it. Nellie Miles, the woman in the car on November 20th, faced scrutiny for her long association with Adams. McFarland, the man who had fled into the dark Kansas night after the killing of George Oldham, was eventually located and held accountable. The network unraveled completely because it had never been built on anything more durable than Adams' personal magnetism and the fear of crossing him. What does the story of Edward James Adams mean, considered at this distance of more than 100 years? It means that danger frequently arrives in attractive packaging, that the qualities which draw people to someone, charm, confidence, physical appeal, social ease, are entirely neutral. They can build communities or destroy them, depending on the will behind them. Eddie Adams used every ounce of his natural magnetism in service of violence and self-interest, and the people drawn into his orbit paid for that proximity in ways that ranged from prison sentences to death. It means that systems of confinement, however well constructed, are not guarantees. Adams escaped twice from facilities designed specifically to hold men like him, and each escape was followed by escalating violence. The lesson for the law enforcement community of 1921 was written in blood across Kansas, Missouri, and Iowa. Some individuals require not merely incarceration but the most rigorous possible attention during every phase of their custody. It means that violence unchecked compounds. The trajectory of Adams' criminal career was consistent and unidirectional. Toward greater brutality, toward more indiscriminate targets, toward a point at which the original criminal goals of money and freedom had become almost secondary to the violence itself. He began as a bootlegger and petty thief. He ended as a man who beat elderly bank customers to death and killed police officers over romantic disagreements. And it means that communities endure. Wichita buried its officers. It processed its grief through those 9,000 visitors to the city undertaking parlor. It held funerals and trials and sentencing hearings, and it continued. The families of A.L. Young, Robert Fitzpatrick, Charles Hoffman, Charles Jones, George Oldham, and James Creeville carried those losses forward into their own futures. Losses that could not be undone by any verdict or any number of bullets. Edward James Adams. Born William Joseph Wallace, barber, outlaw, train robber, bank robber, killer of 7, escaped prisoner twice over, and the most feared criminal the Prohibition-era Midwest produced. Died on a garage floor in Wichita, Kansas on November 22, 1921, at the age of 34. He left behind him a trail of burned motorcycles, fractured skulls, stolen cars, and broken families that stretched across 3 states and 14 months of sustained, escalating terror. He left behind a city that stood 9,000 strong to confirm his death. And he left behind a story that, more than a century later, still carries in it the cold, specific chill of a man who was exactly as dangerous as everyone said, and who proved it again and again until the very last moment he could. Some men leave behind legacies. Eddie Adams left behind a body count, and a name, 2 names actually, that the Midwest has never entirely forgotten. Thank you for being here and joining us through these dark and captivating stories. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share with anyone who loves a good mystery. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I always love hearing where our true crime family is watching from around the world. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never stop searching for the truth.